How do you choose yourself when you don't yet know who you are? How do you commit to truth when certainty is impossible? How do you become an individual when everything around you demands conformity? These questions pierce to the heart of human existence, capturing the fundamental paradox of living consciously in an uncertain world. They reveal the agonizing gap between our need for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of existence, between our hunger for authentic selfhood and the relentless pressure to conform. For most of us, these remain abstract philosophical puzzles we might ponder occasionally in quiet moments. But for a melancholy young man walking the cobblestone streets of 1840s Copenhagen, these weren't theoretical problems. They were the brutal reality of his daily existence. Every decision, every relationship, every moment of consciousness brought him face to face with these impossible questions. The weight of choosing without certainty, of standing alone against the comfortable illusions of the crowd, of living authentically in a world that rewards conformity. This was the atmosphere he breathed. That young man was Søren Kierkegaard, and the intensity with which he lived these questions would revolutionize philosophy itself. His personal crisis became humanity's philosophical awakening. In 1841, he performed an act that would crystallize his entire philosophical project. He returned his engagement ring to Regine Olsen, the woman he loved, destroying both their happiness for reasons he could never fully explain to her or to himself. This wasn't mere romantic indecision. It was the concrete embodiment of his revolutionary insight that existence cannot be systematized, that the most important decisions in life must be made without rational justification. If one had had faith, one would have remained with Regine, he wrote in his journal, capturing the terrible paradox at the heart of authentic existence. Here was a man who understood that genuine commitment, whether to another person, to truth, or to oneself, requires a leap beyond rational proof. His broken engagement became the key to understanding his entire philosophical vision. That human existence is fundamentally different from objective reality, that it cannot be captured in systematic philosophy, and that authentic selfhood requires the courage to choose without guarantees. This personal anguish gave birth to a radical declaration that would shake the foundations of Western thought. Existence cannot be systematized. Against Hegel's magnificent systematic philosophy, which promised to explain all of reality through rational dialectic, Kierkegaard insisted that the most important truths, how to live, what to believe, who to become, cannot be resolved through objective analysis. The individual is the category through which, in a religious respect, this age, all history, the human race as a whole, must pass, he proclaimed, making the solitary existing person the center of philosophical concern. This wasn't merely academic disagreement, it was philosophical revolution. If Kierkegaard was right, then centuries of Western philosophy had been asking the wrong questions, seeking objective answers to subjective problems, trying to systematize what must remain paradoxical and personal. Philosophy needed to abandon its pretense of detached objectivity and embrace the passionate, uncertain, anxiety-ridden reality of human existence. From this insight flowed the concepts that would make Kierkegaard the father of existentialism. Anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, revealing our terrifying responsibility for self-creation, despair as the sickness unto death, the unconscious refusal to accept our authentic selves, the leap of faith that transcends rational proof, and the path to authentic selfhood through passionate commitment against social conformity. Works like Either or Fear and Trembling, the concept of anxiety, and the sickness unto death created entirely new ways of understanding what it means to exist as a conscious, choosing, responsibility-bearing individual. His 19th-century insights speak with startling relevance to our contemporary situation. His analysis of public and mass media as creating spiritual conformity whilst promising democratic participation proves prophetic in our age of social media echo chambers. Part 1. The Problem of Existence. Kierkegaard launched his philosophical career with a devastating attack on the very foundation of systematic philosophy. The systematic idea is the identity of subject and object, the unity of thought and being, he declared. Existence, on the other hand, is their separation. With this single insight, he shattered the grand ambition of Hegelian philosophy, the dream of constructing a complete rational system that would encompass all of reality within its logical structure. Hegel had promised to show how all contradictions could be resolved through dialectical reason, how every aspect of existence could find its proper place within the system. But Kierkegaard saw through this magnificent construction to its fatal flaw. It had no place for the existing individual. The system was like a grand palace, he observed, where no one actually lives. It could map the logical structure of reality with breathtaking comprehensiveness, yet it could not address the fundamental predicament of the person who must wake up each morning and decide how to live. This critique struck at the heart of objective philosophy's deepest assumption that the most important truths about human existence could be discovered through detached, rational analysis. Kierkegaard revealed this as a profound category mistake. The existing individual cannot step outside existence to view it objectively. We are always already embedded within the very reality we seek to understand, making our choices from within the stream of lived experience, rather than from some neutral standpoint above it. The revolutionary force of this insight becomes clear when we grasp what Kierkegaard meant by his famous declaration that truth is subjectivity. He was not advocating relativism or denying objective facts. Rather, he was distinguishing between two fundamentally different kinds of truth. Objective knowledge deals with facts that can be verified independently of the knower. Mathematical theorems, scientific laws, historical events. But existential truth must be lived and appropriated personally. It transforms the knower in the very act of being known. Consider Kierkegaard's example of religious truth. One might possess complete objective knowledge about God, all the theological arguments, all the historical evidence, all the philosophical proofs. But this objective knowledge remains utterly different from existing in relationship with God, from having one's life transformed by faith. The objective knower treats God as an object of study. The existing believer encounters God as the absolute reality that gives meaning to existence itself. This distinction applies to all the most crucial questions of human life. How should one live? What should one value? Whom should one love? These questions cannot be answered through detached rational analysis because they require passionate personal commitment. They demand not just correct information, but the transformation of one's entire existence. The person who approaches love objectively, cataloging its characteristics and analyzing its logic, has missed love entirely. Love must be lived, risked, suffered. It cannot be known from the outside. Here, we encounter the fundamental paradox of human existence that systematic philosophy cannot resolve. As Kierkegaard observed, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. This temporal structure means we must make our most crucial decisions without knowing their outcomes, commit ourselves without certainty, take responsibility for choices we cannot fully justify rationally. We marry without knowing how the relationship will unfold. We choose careers without seeing their ultimate consequences. We commit to values without being able to prove their absolute validity. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the human condition that better reasoning might correct. It is the fundamental structure that makes authentic existence possible. If we could deduce the correct choices through logical analysis, we would be reduced to calculating machines rather than free, responsible agents. The limitation of rational thought becomes apparent precisely when we confront these deepest questions. Reason can analyze the concept of love with great sophistication, but it cannot tell us whom to love. It can examine moral principles with logical rigor, but it cannot generate the passion necessary to live ethically. It can construct proofs for God's existence, but it cannot create faith. At the heart of Kierkegaard's philosophical revolution stands a declaration that overturns centuries of Western thought. The individual is the category through which, in a religious respect, this age, all history, the human race as a whole, must pass. This represents nothing less than a complete inversion of traditional philosophy's approach to understanding human existence. Where previous thinkers sought to comprehend individuals by placing them within universal categories, essential natures, or systematic principles, Kierkegaard insists that the individual cannot be reduced to any such abstractions. The individual, in Kierkegaard's vision, exists as an irreducible, concrete reality that must be understood on its own terms. This is not the shallow individualism of modern consumer culture, nor the political individualism that simply opposes collective authority. Rather, it recognizes the fundamental structure of human existence itself. Each person represents a unique synthesis of the infinite and finite, the eternal and temporal, that cannot be replicated or replaced. The individual is not merely one example amongst many of some universal human essence, but rather a singular occurrence in existence that brings something entirely new into being. This primacy becomes clear when we examine how society and objective thinking conspire to make us forget our individual existence. Kierkegaard's critique of the crowd and the public reveals these as dangerous abstractions that eliminate personal responsibility by dissolving the individual into anonymous mass opinion. The crowd has no concrete existence. It is a phantom that allows people to hide from the weight of individual choice and responsibility. When we think and act as part of the crowd, we cease to exist as genuine individuals and become mere functions of social processes. Modern democratic society presents a particularly sophisticated challenge to authentic individuality. It promises individual freedom, whilst actually creating more refined forms of spiritual conformity. Social roles, professional identities, and cultural categories offer the seductive comfort of belonging, but at the cost of authentic selfhood. The businessman, the academic, the citizen. These roles provide ready-made meanings and values that spare us the difficulty of forging our own existence. Yet, in accepting these predetermined patterns, we avoid the fundamental task of becoming who we truly are. Objective thinking compounds this problem by treating individuals as examples of universal principles rather than as unique, irreplaceable persons. Scientific psychology reduces the person to psychological types and mechanisms. Social theory explains individual behavior through economic forces or cultural patterns. Even moral philosophy seeks universal principles that can be applied to all rational beings. Each approach, however sophisticated, misses the essential point. Existence is always particular, concrete, and personal. This is why authentic individuality requires heroic commitment to stand as a single one against the pressure of universal conformity. Kierkegaard's concept of that single one, hin enkelte, represents his ideal reader and the authentic human being. This single one has the courage to take absolute responsibility for their existence, to make decisions that cannot be justified by appeal to universal principles or social approval. They understand that becoming a genuine individual means accepting the loneliness and difficulty of a path that often leads away from family expectations, social conventions, and even religious institutions. This is not antisocial rebellion for its own sake, but rather the necessary foundation for any authentic relationship with others or with God. Only the person who has become a genuine individual can truly encounter another individual. Only the one who has taken responsibility for their own existence can enter into authentic love or faith. The crowd can neither love nor believe. These are possibilities that exist only for the individual who has dared to stand alone. The philosophical foundation for this primacy lies in Kierkegaard's analysis of existence itself. Existence, he argues, is always the synthesis of infinite and finite, eternal and temporal, necessity and possibility. This synthesis cannot occur in abstract philosophical systems or universal concepts. It can only be actualized in the concrete life of an individual person. Truth is subjectivity. This revolutionary principle stands at the heart of Kierkegaard's entire philosophical project, challenging 2,000 years of philosophical tradition that sought truth through objective detachment. For Kierkegaard, the most profound truths about human existence cannot be grasped through the methods of science or systematic philosophy, but only through passionate personal engagement with the questions that define our lives. Consider his famous example. If one who lives in the midst of Christendom goes up to the house of God, the house of the true God, with the true conception of God in his knowledge, and prays, but prays in a false spirit, and one who lives in an idolatrous community prays with the entire passion of the infinite, although his eyes rest upon the image of an idol, where is there most truth? The answer reveals everything about Kierkegaard's understanding of truth. The passionate believer praying to an idol possesses more truth than the correct believer praying without passion. Because existential truth concerns not what is believed, but how it is believed. This distinction between objective and subjective truth cuts to the core of human existence. Objective truth concerns what is the case independently of any particular knower. Mathematical theorems, scientific laws, historical facts. Such truths remain the same, whether we care about them passionately or regard them with complete indifference. But subjective truth concerns the relationship between the knower and what is known. And this relationship transforms both the truth and the person who appropriates it. The passion of inwardness is the truth. This insight reveals why the most important truths about human existence require personal appropriation through decisive commitment. Truths about love cannot be learned from psychology textbooks, but only through the risk of loving. Truths about courage emerge not from studying heroic literature, but from facing danger ourselves. Truths about moral responsibility cannot be grasped through ethical theory, but only through the anguish of choosing between competing goods whilst knowing that our choice defines who we are. This passionate commitment is not mere emotion or arbitrary preference. Kierkegaard understood that subjective truth possesses its own rigorous demands. The passionate believer must appropriate truth through lived engagement, personal risk, and the willingness to stake one's existence on what cannot be objectively proven. This transforms both the knower and the truth known. Subjective truth is not something we possess, but something that possesses us, reshaping our entire mode of existence. the objective stance becomes a form of escape from existence itself. Kierkegaard's critique of speculative philosophy and scientific detachment reveals how the posture of objective observation allows us to avoid the personal risk and commitment that authentic existence requires. The objective thinker treats existence as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived, maintaining a safe distance from the very questions that demand our total engagement. This detachment, whilst valuable for scientific knowledge, becomes spiritually destructive when applied to existential questions. How should one live? What should one value? How should one relate to others and to God? These questions cannot be answered through rational analysis alone because they require us to commit ourselves before we possess complete knowledge. The demand for objective certainty in existential matters reveals itself as spiritual cowardice, an attempt to avoid the anxiety and responsibility that define human existence. The most important truths about human existence require personal appropriation through decisive commitment, rather than rational proof. Kierkegaard understood that we cannot think our way into authentic existence. We must choose our way into it. The thing is to understand myself, he wrote, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which one can live and die. This truth, for which we can live and die, cannot be discovered through philosophical speculation, but only through the passionate commitment of our entire existence. It emerges through the concrete choices we make, the relationships we form, the values we embrace with our whole being. Part 2. The aesthetic stage of existence. The aesthetic stage represents life lived as pure immediacy, a sophisticated pursuit of pleasure, beauty, and the perpetually interesting that Kierkegaard explored through the aesthetic papers in Either or. Here exists the individual who has mastered the art of living beautifully, extracting maximum enjoyment from each moment, whilst carefully avoiding anything that would demand sustained commitment or moral responsibility. The aesthete cultivates mood and atmosphere with exquisite sensitivity, moving through existence like an artist painting with experience itself. This appears, at first glance, to be the most enviable of lives. The aesthete seems magnificently free, cultured beyond measure, capable of finding fascination where others discover only routine. Every experience becomes material for aesthetic appreciation. Every find love affairs, artistic encounters, even melancholy itself transforms into a delicious object of contemplation. The aesthetic individual lives entirely in the present moment, unencumbered by moral obligations or the weight of past decisions, seemingly immune to the anxieties that plague more reflective souls. Kierkegaard's archetypal aesthetic figure emerges in Don Juan, particularly as embodied in Mozart's Don Giovanni. Here stands pure aesthetic existence perfected. Don Juan lives entirely in sensuous immediacy, moving from conquest to conquest without memory of the past or anticipation of the future. Each encounter exists complete in itself, unmarked by regret or moral consideration. Kierkegaard recognized that Don Juan cannot truly be portrayed in literature because literature requires reflection and memory, whilst Don Juan exists in pure musical immediacy. He achieves aesthetic perfection precisely by sacrificing the reflective complexity that defines human existence. This insight reveals something profound about aesthetic existence. It attains its purity by becoming, in crucial ways, inhuman. Don Juan represents desire triumphant over moral consideration. Immediacy, victorious over reflection, esse. But this victory comes at the cost of genuine selfhood. He embodies the aesthetic principle so completely that he ceases to be a person in any meaningful sense, becoming instead a force of nature, beautiful and terrible in its consistency. Yet beneath this surface, vitality lurks an underlying emptiness that eventually betrays itself. The aesthetic strategy of constant novelty and stimulation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as repetition inevitably creeps in, despite all efforts to avoid it. The aesthete discovers that even the most carefully orchestrated experiences begin to feel familiar, that the pursuit of the interesting becomes itself a kind of routine. Kierkegaard captures this aesthetic paralysis in the aesthetic author's devastating confession. One do not care for anything. One do not care to ride. For the exercise is too violent. One do not care to walk. Walking is too strenuous. One do not care to lie down, for one should either have to remain lying, and one do not care to do that, or one should have to get up again, and one do not care to do that either. Here, the aesthetic pursuit of pleasure reveals its ultimate destination. Eighteen, not joy, but a profound spiritual emptiness that no amount of stimulation can fill. The aesthete's desperate flight from boredom exposes the hollowness at the heart of immediate existence. Despite the apparent freedom and sophistication, aesthetic life becomes a sophisticated form of spiritual death. The refusal to commit to anything deeper than immediate pleasure prevents the development of a coherent self. There exists no continuous identity beneath the aesthetic performances, only a series of disconnected moments without narrative coherence or moral development. This fragmentation represents the deepest tragedy of aesthetic existence. Maximum stimulation combined with minimum authentic being. The aesthete achieves perfect freedom from moral responsibility, only to discover that such freedom is indistinguishable from meaninglessness. The very success of the aesthetic project, its ability to transform every experience into material for appreciation, ultimately reveals its failure to generate genuine selfhood. This aesthetic emptiness eventually precipitates a crisis that cannot be resolved within aesthetic terms. The individual faces a moment of recognition, either sink deeper into despair or make the leap into ethical existence, with its demands for commitment, responsibility, and the painful construction of a coherent self through choice and decision. Johannes the Seducer emerges from Kierkegaard's Either or as the most chilling portrait of aesthetic existence, refined to its logical conclusion. This is not the crude sensualist driven by immediate physical desire, but something far more dangerous, a sophisticated manipulator who has transformed seduction into high art. In The Seducer's Diary, Johannes reveals himself as a master psychologist, studying his target Cordelia with the patience of a scientist and the calculation of a chess master. He orchestrates every encounter, every withdrawal, every approach with meticulous precision. The point is to enjoy the situation, he writes, to suck out of it, so to speak, its hidden sweetness. Johannes represents aesthetic existence at its most developed. Intelligence, sensitivity, and cultural refinement, all pressed into service of a fundamentally selfish project. What makes Johannes particularly unsettling is how he treats Cordelia not as a person deserving respect and consideration, but as raw material for his aesthetic experiment. She exists solely to provide him with interesting experiences, her innocence and developing emotions serving as the canvas for his artistic project. She is mine, he declares with cold precision. One do not say that one possess her, for in the physical sense one certainly do not possess her. This reveals the fundamental orientation of aesthetic existence, Other people exist only as sources of pleasure, stimulation, or complexity for the aesthete's endless project of self-cultivation. Johannes's psychological insight into human nature, and it is considerable, serves only manipulation rather than genuine understanding or connection. He studies Cordelia's character with the same detached interest a botanist might study a rare flower, fascinated by her responses, but utterly indifferent to her well-being. The sophistication of Johannes's approach masks a profound spiritual emptiness that is more complete than crude sensuality, precisely because it is more refined. His intelligence, his aesthetic sensitivity, his appreciation for psychological subtlety, all these developed capacities serve only his fundamental selfishness. He has cultivated his mind and sensibilities not for genuine human connection or meaningful engagement with reality, but as tools for more effective manipulation and more refined pleasure-seeking. This represents the paradox of aesthetic sophistication. The very refinement that appears to elevate the aesthete above crude materialism becomes a more subtle, but more thorough form of spiritual death. Johannes's cultural accomplishments and psychological acuity make him not more human, but less so, because every capacity has been corrupted into serving the project of treating others as objects for personal enjoyment. The ultimate revelation comes in Johannes's own recognition of the fundamental emptiness underlying his sophisticated pursuits. Even his successful seduction of Cordelia brings no lasting satisfaction. 17. The moment of conquest is simultaneously the moment when interest dies, and he must begin searching for new projects. He finds himself trapped in an endless cycle of desire, pursuit, conquest, and boredom that can never provide genuine fulfillment. The most painful state of being, he confesses, is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. This sophisticated aesthetic analysis reveals the inherent limitation of any existence organized around personal pleasure and the avoidance of commitment. The aesthete's growing recognition of this emptiness creates the crisis that forces the fundamental question whether to embrace deeper despair or make the leap into ethical existence with its demands for universal moral commitment and genuine responsibility toward others. The aesthete appears, at first glance, to have solved the fundamental problem of human existence. Where others struggle with boredom, routine, and the crushing weight of ordinary life, the aesthetic individual has discovered sophisticated strategies for maintaining perpetual interest and pleasure. Kierkegaard's aesthetic author presents a masterful system, crop rotation of experiences, where one varies not just external circumstances, but internal approaches to the same circumstances. The aesthete cultivates arbitrary moods, practices selective memory and forgetting, and treats life itself as raw material for artistic creation. Every moment becomes an opportunity for aesthetic experience, every encounter a chance to extract something beautiful, interesting, or pleasurable. The aesthete seems to have achieved what everyone desires, complete freedom from obligation, whilst maintaining constant stimulation and avoiding the deadening effects of repetition. This aesthetic mastery extends beyond mere pleasure-seeking into genuine artistry of existence. The aesthete understands that true aesthetic living requires sophistication, not crude hedonism. One must approach experiences with the right mood, at the right time, with the proper degree of detachment to appreciate their aesthetic qualities. The aesthetic individual becomes a connoisseur of moments, collecting experiences like a collector gathers rare objects, each valued for its unique contribution to the overall aesthetic project of an interesting life. Xiaoyu Jinghao Lin 5# is greater than. This appears to be existence at its most refined, maximum pleasure, combined with maximum freedom, beauty extracted from the most ordinary circumstances through the cultivation of aesthetic sensibility. Yet gradually, despite all these sophisticated techniques, repetition begins to creep into aesthetic existence. The aesthete discovers that even the most carefully orchestrated experiences has begun to feel similar, that pleasure becomes mechanical rather than spontaneous, that even the most refined aesthetic strategies cannot indefinitely postpone a growing recognition of emptiness. The aesthetic author confesses with devastating honesty, "My life is absolutely meaningless." When one considers the different periods into which it falls, it seems like the word Schnur in the dictionary, which means, in the first place, a string, in the second place, a daughter-in-law. The very arbitrariness that seemed to provide infinite variety now reveals itself as profound meaninglessness, experiences connected by nothing more substantial than the fact that the same individual happened to have them. This repetition exposes something more troubling than mere boredom. The aesthete begins to recognize that beneath all the aesthetic performances, there is no coherent self, no continuous identity that gives meaning to the succession of experiences. The aesthetic strategy of living entirely in the moment, of treating each experience as complete in itself, prevents the development of character, moral identity, or authentic selfhood, is less than #0. 5# is greater than. The aesthetic author acknowledges this spiritual poverty. One have, one think, the courage to doubt everything. One have, one think, the courage to fight against everything, but one do not have the courage to acknowledge anything, the courage to possess, to own anything. The aesthete can experience everything but can commit to nothing, can appreciate all possibilities, but cannot choose any particular identity or set of values as genuinely his own. This recognition precipitates the aesthetic crisis, the realization that maximum experience has been combined with minimum authentic selfhood. The aesthete has become expert at extracting pleasure from existence whilst remaining fundamentally uncommitted to existence itself. Every experience remains external, every pleasure temporary, every moment disconnected from every other moment by the very aesthetic principles that were supposed to make life continuously interesting. The aesthete discovers that he has no self in any substantial sense, only a succession of aesthetic states, moods, and experiences that provide no foundation for authentic human existence. The aesthetic despair forces a fundamental question that cannot be answered aesthetically. What kind of existence is worth choosing? The failure of aesthetic strategies creates a moment of decision where the individual must either embrace deeper despair and cynicism or make the leap into ethical existence with its demands for universal moral principles and sustained commitment. Part 3. The ethical stage of existence. Judge William stands before us as the embodiment of ethical existence, Kierkegaard's representative of the second stage of human development. Where the aesthetic individual pursued pleasure and novelty, the ethical individual chooses duty and universal moral principles. In Either or, Judge William responds directly to the aesthetic author's celebration of immediate experience with a fundamental challenge. Human existence requires more than pleasure-seeking to achieve genuine meaning and authentic selfhood. The ethical stage emerges as the realm of universal moral duty and social responsibility. Judge William declares that the ethical individual has his teleology in himself. He has his goal in himself, and this goal is his freedom. But this freedom is not arbitrariness. This freedom differs entirely from aesthetic freedom. The aesthetic individual experiences freedom as endless possibility, the burden of choice without criteria. The ethical individual discovers freedom through commitment to universal moral principles that provide objective standards for decision-making and character development. Judge William embodies this ethical commitment through his marriage, his professional career, and his civic responsibilities. His marriage to his wife represents not romantic passion, which inevitably fades, but ethical commitment to the institution of marriage itself. He argues that marriage surpasses romantic love precisely because it involves the choice to love consistently, regardless of fluctuating feelings. Marriage becomes a commitment to mutual moral development, the acceptance of social responsibility, and the recognition that authentic human relationships require more than personal preference or emotional satisfaction. This ethical approach to marriage illuminates the broader structure of ethical existence. The ethical individual organizes life around commitments that transcend immediate desire or personal inclination. Judge William's professional life and civic engagement represent similar commitments to universal ethical principles. He chooses his career not merely for personal satisfaction, but as an expression of social responsibility and moral duty. His civic participation reflects his commitment to universal human dignity and the moral law that governs rational beings. Ethical existence provides what aesthetic existence fundamentally lacks: continuity, purpose, and genuine development of character through sustained commitment. The aesthetic individual remains trapped in the present moment, unable to build lasting meaning because each experience is pursued for its immediate value. The ethical individual escapes this trap by accepting moral law as the objective standard for human action. Through repeated moral choices that build virtue over time, the ethical individual develops authentic character and substantial freedom. This substantial freedom represents moral agency guided by rational principles that can be universally applied. The ethical individual no longer faces the aesthetic burden of endless choice without criteria. Universal moral principles provide clear guidance for decision-making, creating the stability and meaning that aesthetic existence cannot achieve. The ethical emphasis on duty, consistency, and character development through moral commitment offers genuine liberation from the arbitrary freedom of aesthetic choice. The ethical individual's choice of himself occurs through acceptance of moral responsibility and commitment to universal human dignity. This choice of oneself differs fundamentally from aesthetic self-cultivation because it involves accepting moral obligations that constrain personal preference in favor of universal principles. Judge William recognizes that the ethical choice is simultaneously a choice of oneself and a choice of universal human nature. One becomes an authentic individual precisely by accepting the moral law that applies to all rational beings. Yet ethical existence, while solving the aesthetic problem of meaninglessness, raises deeper questions about the ultimate foundation and authority of universal moral principles themselves. The ethical individual commits to moral duty, but from where does this duty derive its binding authority? What happens when universal principles conflict, or when the moral law itself seems inadequate to address the deepest questions of human existence? These tensions point beyond ethical existence toward a third stage that Kierkegaard will explore through the figure of Abraham and the Knight of Faith. Kant's categorical imperative provides the philosophical foundation that transforms mere aesthetic preference into genuine ethical existence. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time will, that it should become a universal law. This principle creates the objective criterion that aesthetic existence desperately lacks. Moral actions become those that can be universalized without contradiction, whilst immoral actions involve treating oneself as an exception to universal principles. The aesthetic individual chooses according to immediate desire or cultural fashion, but the ethical person discovers moral obligation that transcends personal preference, social convention, or individual circumstance. Here emerges genuine moral law that provides clear guidance for action and establishes objective standards for evaluating character and choice. This universality solves the aesthetic problem by eliminating the paralysis of choice without criteria. The ethical individual no longer faces the aesthetic dilemma of choosing amongst equally arbitrary options. Moral law provides clear direction for action and definitive standards for character development. Universal moral principles create genuine moral progress through the cultivation of virtue, the development of moral sentiment, and the gradual alignment of desire with duty. The aesthetic person remains trapped in endless cycles of pleasure and boredom. But the ethical person discovers genuine development through moral growth. This universality also creates authentic community. Ethical individuals recognize each other as fellow moral agents committed to the same rational principles, united not by shared taste or cultural background, but by common commitment to moral law. The ethical person discovers human dignity through conformity to rational moral principles that express universal human nature. Ethical existence reveals that human dignity consists in our capacity for moral agency, our ability to act according to rational principles rather than mere inclination or desire. Kant's profound insight becomes central. Moral worth comes not from the consequences of action, but from the good will that acts from duty rather than inclination. This creates genuine self-respect and respect for others as rational moral agents capable of moral development and deserving of moral consideration, regardless of their particular characteristics, circumstances, or personal appeal. The aesthetic person values individuals for their charm, beauty, or entertainment value, but the ethical person recognizes the inherent dignity of rational moral agency itself. Yet ethical existence raises a deeper question that ultimately threatens its own foundation. Why should universal principles have absolute authority over individual existence? The ethical stage, while solving aesthetic problems, creates new philosophical tensions that become increasingly unavoidable. Why should universal moral law override particular individual circumstances that seem to demand exception? What gives moral principles their authority over concrete human existence with all its complexity and uniqueness? How can universal principles adequately address situations where moral duties conflict or where individual circumstances seem to require actions that cannot be universalized? The ethical person begins to recognize moral inadequacy, not merely failure to live up to moral standards, but the insufficiency of universal principles themselves to address the deepest existential questions. This recognition creates the crisis that drives ethical existence toward its own transcendence, opening the possibility of religious existence that moves beyond both aesthetic pleasure and ethical duty toward a relationship with the absolute that cannot be captured in universal principles. The ethical stage represents humanity's highest achievement within the realm of universal principles and rational moral law. Here stands the individual who has transcended aesthetic self-indulgence, embraced duty over pleasure, and committed themselves to universal moral standards that apply equally to all rational beings. Yet Kierkegaard reveals a profound inadequacy at the heart of ethical existence, NG-self. Despite its nobility and genuine moral value, it cannot provide ultimate meaning or handle the deepest existential questions about human existence. The ethical person discovers that universal moral principles, whilst necessary for social life and character development, remain abstract when confronted with the concrete complexity of individual existence. Kierkegaard's insight cuts to the core. Ethical existence still treats the individual as an instance of universal principles rather than as an irreducible, unique person with absolute worth. The moral law speaks in universals. Act only according to maxims you could will to be universal laws. But existence unfolds in the particular, the unrepeatable, the absolutely individual. This creates an inevitable tension. The ethical demand for universalizability can conflict directly with the particular demands of individual existence and authentic personal relationships. When Abraham prepares to sacrifice Isaac, no universal ethical principle can justify his action. Indeed, ethics condemns it as murder. Yet Kierkegaard suggests that something higher than ethics might call the individual beyond universal moral categories into a realm where the particular relationship to the absolute takes precedence over universal principles. The ethical person faces another devastating discovery: the problem of guilt and their own moral inadequacy. Despite sincere commitment to moral duty, the more seriously one takes ethical demands, the more clearly one recognizes the unbridgeable gap between moral ideals and actual performance. This isn't mere weakness or lack of commitment. It's the structural impossibility of achieving perfect moral purity through ethical effort alone. The ethical individual experiences growing awareness of moral failure, the persistence of selfish inclination, despite moral commitment, and the haunting recognition that they cannot fulfill the very moral law they acknowledge as absolutely binding. Every genuine attempt at moral perfection reveals new depths of moral inadequacy. The person who never seriously attempts moral living can maintain illusions about their goodness, but the committed ethical person discovers the intractable reality of moral failure. This recognition creates a profound crisis for ethical existence. If we cannot fulfill the moral law we acknowledge as binding, what hope exists for authentic moral existence? The ethical person stands condemned by their own standards, unable to escape the judgment of moral inadequacy, yet unable to abandon the moral commitments that create this judgment. Kierkegaard reveals how universal ethical principles can become another form of escape from radical individuality and authentic personal responsibility. Conformity to moral law, while superior to aesthetic self-indulgence, can still represent a refusal to face the ultimate questions of existence that cannot be answered through appeal to universal principles. The ethical person can hide behind moral respectability, using adherence to universal principles to avoid confronting the absolute demands of authentic existence. Ethical existence can become a sophisticated form of hiding from God and from the absolute demands that transcend universal moral categories. Moral respectability masks spiritual complacency and the avoidance of the deepest questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. The ethical person achieves social recognition and self-respect through moral conformity, but this very achievement can prevent them from facing the more radical questions about their relationship to the absolute. This crisis drives the ethical person toward the religious stage through the recognition that ethical existence, whilst necessary, is not sufficient for authentic human existence. Part 4. The religious stage of existence. The religious stage represents existence's highest form, not merely another option alongside aesthetic pleasure and ethical duty, but a qualitatively different mode of being that transforms the entire structure of human existence. Where the aesthete pursues immediate satisfaction and the ethical individual commits to universal moral principles, The religious person enters into absolute relationship with God that relativizes all finite concerns while simultaneously giving them their proper significance. Kierkegaard captures this paradox perfectly. The religious individual relates himself absolutely to the absolute and relatively to the relative. God becomes the absolute center that puts everything else in perspective. Yet this does not diminish finite existence, but reveals its true meaning. This transformation appears most dramatically in Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah. Kierkegaard opens Fear and Trembling with the haunting image of Abraham walking beside Isaac for 3 days, carrying the wood for the sacrifice, believing he must kill the son he loves more than his own life. Abraham embodies religious existence because he acts in absolute obedience to God, despite the impossibility of explaining or justifying his action to anyone else, including himself. He cannot appeal to universal ethical principles, cannot claim that killing Isaac serves some greater good, cannot even be certain that his understanding of God's command is correct. Yet he proceeds, sustained only by his absolute relationship with the absolute. Abraham's situation reveals what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical, the defining characteristic of religious existence. The religious individual stands ready to suspend universal moral principles when called by absolute duty to God. Abraham's willingness to kill Isaac violates the universal ethical prohibition against murder, the fundamental duty of father to son, every principle of rational moral behavior. Yet this apparent violation of ethics represents the highest form of human existence because it expresses absolute commitment to God. The religious individual stands higher than the universal because he relates absolutely to the absolute rather than making finite ethical principles his ultimate concern. This creates the central paradox of religious existence. It appears to violate ethics whilst actually fulfilling the deepest purpose of ethical existence. Ethics seeks to establish right relationship between human beings, but religious existence recognizes that proper human relationships flow from right relationship with God. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac paradoxically expresses his deepest love for Isaac. See, love purified of all finite attachment, all desire to possess or control, all confusion between loving the person and loving one's own happiness in the person. Religious existence does not eliminate ethical concern, but transforms it by grounding it in absolute rather than relative commitment. The religious individual thus achieves a transformed relationship with finite existence itself. Absolute commitment to God does not eliminate concern for finite things, but places them in proper perspective. Career, family, social responsibilities, personal happiness, NKC. All these matter because God cares about them, not because they possess independent, ultimate significance. This creates genuine freedom from finite anxieties, whilst maintaining genuine engagement with finite responsibilities. The religious person can invest fully in temporal concerns, precisely because their ultimate security rests elsewhere. They can love finite things properly because they do not demand infinite satisfaction from them. This religious transformation of existence culminates in the figure of the Knight of Faith, infinite, one who lives simultaneously in the finite and infinite, appearing outwardly ordinary, whilst inwardly transformed by absolute relationship with God. The Knight of Faith represents Kierkegaard's vision of the highest form of human existence, a person who lives simultaneously in the finite and infinite through absolute trust in God, combined with complete engagement in temporal existence. This extraordinary individual first makes what Kierkegaard calls the movement of infinite resignation, giving up all finite attachments and desires, surrendering every earthly hope and expectation. Yet, remarkably, the knight of faith then receives everything back through faith in God's goodness and power. As Kierkegaard describes it, he resigned everything infinitely, and then he grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. This creates a unique form of existence that combines infinite passion with finite contentment, absolute commitment with relative engagement, a paradoxical unity that transcends both aesthetic, pleasure-seeking, and ethical duty-following. What makes the Knight of Faith so remarkable is precisely how unremarkable he appears. Kierkegaard insists that the religious person appears outwardly ordinary whilst being inwardly transformed by absolute relationship with God. The Knight of Faith looks like a tax collector who goes about his daily business with apparent normalcy whilst living in absolute relationship with the Eternal. He pays his bills, enjoys his dinner, takes pleasure in his work, all with genuine contentment and engagement. This ordinariness is not a disguise or pretense, but the authentic expression of someone who has achieved the highest form of human existence without withdrawing from normal human life. This contrasts sharply with both aesthetic extraordinariness, which seeks to stand out and be noticed, and ethical universality, which seeks to conform to moral law. The religious individual achieves authentic existence through hiddenness and apparent normalcy, living the deepest truths whilst appearing perfectly conventional. The Knight of Faith transcends even the tragic hero. The tragic hero acts for universal ethical purposes that can be understood and admired by others. Agamemnon sacrificing Iphigenia for the good of Greece, Brutus condemning his sons for the good of Rome. These figures remain within the ethical sphere and can be honored by society because their actions serve universal moral principles. The Knight of Faith, however, acts for absolute religious purposes that cannot be communicated or justified to anyone else. His relationship with God places him beyond ethical categories, beyond social recognition or rational justification. Where the tragic hero can explain his actions in terms that others understand and respect, the Knight of Faith stands alone before God in a relationship that transcends all finite understanding. This isolation is both the terror and the glory of religious existence. This absolute relationship with the Absolute creates the fundamental paradox of religious existence, the simultaneous experience of infinite responsibility and infinite trust. The religious individual experiences terror because of the absolute demands of relationship with God. There is no finite authority or universal principle to which one can appeal for justification. Every decision must be made in direct relationship with the Eternal, without the comfort of rules or social approval. Yet this same relationship provides infinite joy, because it represents the fulfillment of human existence in relationship with its ultimate ground and purpose. The Knight of Faith experiences maximum anxiety combined with maximum peace, absolute isolation combined with absolute relationship. This paradoxical structure reveals both the terror and the necessity of faith that acts beyond rational understanding, demanding examination of how such faith manifests in concrete situations where everything finite seems to oppose the call of the infinite. Abraham stands at the edge of Mount Moriah, knife raised above his beloved son Isaac, poised to complete the most incomprehensible act in human history. God has commanded him to sacrifice the child of promise, the Son, through whom all nations were to be blessed. No rational calculation can justify this action. No ethical principle can sanction it. Yet Abraham moves forward without hesitation, without argument, without delay. In this terrible moment, Kierkegaard reveals the essential structure of religious existence, a mode of being that transcends both aesthetic, pleasure-seeking, and ethical duty to embrace absolute relationship with the divine. The biblical narrative presents Abraham with an absolute conflict between divine command and every finite consideration. Natural love cries out against sacrificing his son. Ethical duty forbids murder, particularly of the innocent. Social responsibility demands protecting the future of his people. Yet Abraham responds with immediate obedience, demonstrating what Kierkegaard calls the movement of faith, a leap beyond rational calculation and moral justification into pure trust. This situation crystallizes the fundamental choice that defines religious existence, between finite security, grounded in human understanding, and absolute commitment, grounded in divine relationship. Abraham's response reveals the absolute paradox that makes religious existence incommunicable. He cannot explain his action to anyone, including himself, because religious truth transcends rational discourse entirely. Kierkegaard emphasizes that Abraham cannot speak. There are no universal categories, no rational principles, no ethical frameworks that can make his behavior intelligible to others. This creates the essential loneliness of religious existence. The individual stands utterly alone before God in a relationship that cannot be mediated through social institutions, philosophical arguments, or moral reasoning. This incommunicability is not a defect of religious existence, but its necessary structure. If Abraham's action could be explained rationally, it would not represent absolute relationship with the divine. The moment faith becomes rationally comprehensible, it ceases to be faith and becomes merely another form of human calculation. The religious individual must act without the comfort of universal understanding, without the security of social approval, without even the possibility of rational self-justification. Abraham embodies faith as passionate commitment beyond rational understanding, through what Kierkegaard calls the double movement. First, he makes infinite resignation, giving up Isaac completely and accepting that he will lose his beloved son forever. This movement acknowledges the absolute demands of the situation without compromise or self-deception. Second, he makes the movement of faith itself, receiving Isaac back through trust in God's goodness and power. By faith, Abraham did not renounce his claim upon Isaac, but by faith he got Isaac, Kierkegaard explains. This double movement creates the paradox of faith. Absolute trust, combined with complete uncertainty, infinite passion, combined with finite hope. The terror and isolation of Abraham's position reveals both the cost and the ultimate fulfillment of religious existence. He must act without universal ethical support, standing against every finite authority, enchos, family bonds, social expectations, moral principles, in obedience to absolute divine command. The fear and trembling that characterizes his situation reflects the recognition that he is absolutely responsible before God, without any finite security or rational justification for his actions. Yet Abraham represents the highest form of human existence precisely because he appears to violate ethics. He embodies the authentic human relationship with the absolute that gives ultimate meaning to all finite existence, including ethics itself. The ethical stage, with its universal principles and social duties, finds its proper foundation only through the religious relationship that transcends it. Part 5. The concept of anxiety. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis, and freedom looks down into its own possibility, laying hold of finiteness to support itself. This precise definition from Kierkegaard's the concept of anxiety reveals something extraordinary about human consciousness. Anxiety is not merely another emotion amongst others, but the psychological state that discloses the fundamental structure of human existence as radically free, self-determining, and responsible. When we experience anxiety, we encounter our own freedom as both possibility and burden, recognizing that we must choose without predetermined guidelines or guaranteed outcomes. This distinguishes anxiety from every other psychological state because it reveals what we are, beings condemned to freedom, thrust into existence without our consent, yet bearing complete responsibility for who we become. Anxiety emerges precisely at those moments when we confront the reality that our choices matter, absolutely, that we could choose anything, and that our choices will determine not merely what we do, but who we are. The dizziness Kierkegaard describes captures this vertiginous recognition that there is no solid ground beneath our moral decisions, no external authority that can relieve us of the weight of choice. Fear has a specific object that can be identified, analyzed, and potentially overcome. We fear the wild animal, the economic collapse, the diagnosis, the definite threats that exist in the world and can be met with concrete responses. Anxiety confronts something far more unsettling: the nothingness of pure possibility itself. Kierkegaard's insight that anxiety is anxiety about nothing does not mean there is no real threat, but that the threat is our own freedom, our own capacity to choose in ways that will fundamentally alter our existence. This nothingness is simultaneously the source of human creativity and human terror. It is nothing because it represents pure possibility, the open horizon of choices not yet made, paths not yet taken, selves not yet actualized. Yet this nothing is everything, because it is the space within which we create ourselves and our world. The student facing career choices experiences anxiety not because any particular career is threatening, but because choosing one path means foreclosing countless others, and because no external authority can guarantee that any choice is correct. The paradox deepens when we recognize that anxiety is simultaneously attractive and repulsive. This reveals our profoundly ambivalent relationship with our own nature as free beings. We desire the power to choose and create ourselves, to be the authors of our own existence, to transcend the limitations imposed by nature, society, and circumstance. Yet we are terrified by the responsibility and uncertainty this freedom entails, by the recognition that we cannot blame our choices on external forces or predetermined destiny. This creates the distinctive phenomenology of anxiety, a mixture of fascination and dread, attraction and repulsion, that reflects our complex relationship with our own freedom. We stand at the edge of possibility, like someone at the edge of a cliff, simultaneously drawn to leap and terrified of falling. The attraction is real, because freedom represents our highest possibility, our capacity to transcend given conditions and create meaning. The repulsion is equally real, because freedom means accepting ultimate responsibility for our existence without guarantee of success or meaning. This paradox explains why human beings so often flee from freedom into various forms of conformity, addiction, or bad faith, while simultaneously being drawn back to authentic self-determination. The aesthetic individual loses himself in immediate pleasures to avoid the anxiety of moral choice. The conventional moralist adopts social rules to escape the dizziness of personal responsibility. Yet neither escape succeeds completely, because anxiety returns whenever we glimpse our fundamental freedom. Anxiety cannot be eliminated without destroying what makes us human. It is not a psychological disorder to be cured, but the inevitable accompaniment of human freedom and moral responsibility. Attempts to eliminate anxiety through aesthetic distraction, ethical conformity, or religious fanaticism actually represent attempts to escape from authentic human existence itself. Kierkegaard's analysis of Adam's state before the fall reveals something profoundly unsettling about human consciousness itself. Innocence, he argues, is not the pure bliss we imagine, but rather dreaming anxiety, a condition that contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Even in paradise, before any knowledge of good and evil, Adam experiences what Kierkegaard describes as a peculiar unease. In this state, there is peace and repose, but there is simultaneously something else that is not contention and strife. For there is indeed nothing against which to strive. What, then, is it? Nothing. But what effect does nothing have? It begets anxiety. This anxiety of innocence stems from consciousness itself, the human capacity to be aware of possibility without yet understanding what those possibilities mean. Adam possesses the structural capacity for choice whilst remaining ignorant of what choice entails. He can sense that he might act differently than he does, that alternatives exist, but he cannot grasp what these alternatives are or what they might mean. This vague awareness of his own freedom creates a fundamental disquiet that pervades even paradise. The fall becomes inevitable, not through external compulsion, but through the internal logic of human consciousness, confronting its own capacity for self-determination. The divine prohibition transforms this dreaming anxiety into acute moral consciousness. When God commands, "You shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil," something revolutionary occurs in Adam's awareness. The prohibition introduces categories that previously had no meaning. Obedience and disobedience, permitted and forbidden, right and wrong. Before the command, Adam had no concept of transgression because he had no framework for understanding moral distinction. The prohibition creates the very moral universe it seeks to govern. Kierkegaard recognizes that this command awakens in him freedom's possibility. The prohibition does not merely forbid a particular action. It reveals to Adam that he possesses the power to choose between alternatives. For the first time, he becomes conscious of himself as an agent capable of defying divine will. The command intended to preserve innocence actually destroys it by making Adam aware of his capacity for moral choice. This reveals the paradoxical structure of all moral consciousness. The very awareness that enables moral behavior simultaneously creates the possibility for moral failure. The transition from innocence to experience cannot be explained through rational analysis. EBH. It represents what Kierkegaard calls the leap, a qualitative transformation that simply happens without logical necessity. No amount of psychological or theological investigation can explain why Adam chooses to eat the forbidden fruit. The choice represents a mysterious passage from possibility to actuality that cannot be reduced to prior causes or rational motivations. Adam does not choose evil because he understands what evil means. He cannot understand evil until after he has chosen it. This leap reveals a fundamental category of human existence that resists rational mediation. Kierkegaard insists that the leap cannot be explained or justified beforehand. It can only be acknowledged afterward as the decisive moment through which we become responsible moral agents. Adam's situation paradigmatically represents every human being's confrontation with moral choice. We must choose between alternatives we cannot fully comprehend, take responsibility for decisions whose consequences remain unknown, and live with outcomes that seemed arbitrary at the moment of decision. the fall discloses the permanent structure of human moral existence. We are always choosing in uncertainty, always responsible for outcomes we cannot predict, always confronting the gap between what we might do and what we actually do. This makes anxiety the enduring condition of human consciousness. Trauma, not merely a psychological state, but the fundamental attunement of beings capable of moral choice. Every significant decision recapitulates Adam's original situation. We must leap from possibility into actuality without adequate justification, becoming responsible for choices we cannot fully understand in advance. This analysis reveals how human freedom necessarily involves the capacity for both good and evil, making anxiety and sin the fundamental alternatives that define moral existence itself. Anxiety reveals the most profound truth about human existence. We possess a radical moral freedom that makes us responsible for our fundamental orientation toward life itself. Unlike other creatures who follow predetermined patterns, humans exist in a state of perpetual moral possibility. We are not hardwired toward virtue or vice, but must choose our basic attitude toward existence, toward others, and toward God. Kierkegaard recognized anxiety as the intermediate determinant between innocence and sin, the psychological state in which moral choice becomes both possible and necessary. This makes anxiety simultaneously dangerous and valuable. Dangerous because it opens the possibility of choosing wrongly, valuable because it equally opens the possibility of authentic moral development and genuine relationship with the divine. The temporal structure of moral consciousness reveals itself through the relationship between anxiety and guilt. Anxiety represents our forward-looking recognition of our capacity to choose wrongly, whilst guilt embodies our backward-looking recognition that we have indeed chosen wrongly. This creates the distinctive temporality of moral existence. We live simultaneously in anxious anticipation of future choices and guilty remembrance of past failures. This temporal tension makes moral development possible rather than merely theoretical. Anxiety motivates us to choose carefully, understanding the weight of our decisions, whilst guilt teaches us the real consequences of our choices and motivates genuine repentance and moral growth. We cannot escape this temporal structure without escaping moral responsibility itself. Many attempt to eliminate anxiety through various strategies: aesthetic distraction, ethical conformity, religious fanaticism, or psychological techniques. Yet these represent attempts to escape from moral responsibility itself. Kierkegaard understood that anxiety is not a psychological disorder requiring cure, but the inevitable accompaniment of human freedom and moral consciousness. Learning to live authentically with anxiety, rather than fleeing from it, becomes the foundation for genuine moral courage and authentic relationship with others and with God. The person who has learned to face anxiety directly has learned to face their own freedom directly. Anxiety serves as both the source of human creativity and the burden of moral responsibility that makes authentic existence simultaneously possible and difficult. Because we experience anxiety about our choices, we are forced to create meaning, value, and identity through our decisions, rather than receiving them as predetermined gifts. This same anxiety makes moral responsibility an unavoidable burden. N89. We cannot escape recognizing that our choices matter ultimately, and that we become the kind of person we are through our decisions. This creates the fundamental human situation. We are condemned to be free, blessed to be creative, and responsible for becoming authentic individuals through our response to the anxiety that reveals our freedom. When we fail in this task of authentic selfhood, we encounter despair, e.c., the sickness unto death that reveals both our spiritual nature and our need for proper relationship with the eternal ground of existence. Part 6. The sickness unto death. The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self, and in relating itself to its own self, relates itself to another. This formulation, perhaps Kierkegaard's most precise and revolutionary definition, captures something extraordinary about human consciousness that philosophy had never adequately grasped. We are not simply objects in the world, nor even complex systems that respond to stimuli. The self exists only in the activity of relating to itself, I not as self. Yet, this self-relation is possible only because the self is grounded in a power beyond itself. This relational structure explains both human dignity and human dependence in a single stroke. We possess genuine self-determination because we can relate to ourselves, examine our motives, choose our fundamental orientation toward existence. Yet, we cannot ground this capacity in ourselves alone. The very ability to relate to oneself presupposes a ground that makes such relating possible. This is why attempts at pure self-creation inevitably fail. Shaw. The self discovers it cannot create the conditions of its own existence, or guarantee its own meaning and value. Human existence involves the ongoing task of holding together contradictory elements that define our nature. We are finite beings with infinite aspirations, temporal creatures with eternal concerns, necessary beings with genuine possibilities for self-determination. This synthesis of finite and infinite, temporal and eternal, necessity and possibility must be actively maintained rather than simply possessed. We can collapse into pure finitude, becoming absorbed in immediate pleasures and concerns, whilst losing sight of our eternal dimension. We can lose ourselves in infinite possibility, becoming paralyzed by endless options whilst never committing to actual existence. We can mistake necessity for fate whilst abandoning our freedom, or mistake freedom for arbitrary choice whilst ignoring the constraints of our situation. This makes selfhood an achievement rather than a given. The synthesis that constitutes authentic human existence requires constant effort and proper grounding. We must learn to hold together our finite limitations with our infinite longings, our temporal commitments with our eternal concerns, our necessary circumstances with our genuine freedom. This is not a problem to be solved once, but a task to be renewed continuously throughout existence. The self cannot ground itself, despite its capacity for self-relation. This relation that we are is grounded transparently in the power which posited it. Attempts at pure self-determination lead inevitably to despair, because the self discovers its fundamental dependence. We do not create our own consciousness, freedom, or capacity for relationship. These are given to us as gifts, yet we must achieve authentic selfhood as a task through our choices, commitments, and fundamental orientation toward existence. This creates the central paradox of authentic existence: maximum responsibility combined with ultimate dependence. We must take full responsibility for our choices and character development, while simultaneously acknowledging our dependence on God as the ultimate ground of existence. This is not a contradiction, but the very structure of human selfhood. We are most authentically ourselves when we recognize both our infinite responsibility. This complex structure makes despair inevitable for finite beings who must take infinite responsibility for themselves without being able to ground themselves ultimately. We receive selfhood as a gift we did not earn. Yet we must achieve authentic selfhood as a task we cannot avoid. This tension explains why despair is not simply a psychological disorder, but the fundamental spiritual condition of human existence. Most people live in unconscious despair, mistaking spiritual death for normal existence. They have not achieved the proper relation to themselves or to the power that grounds them. They exist in various forms of spiritual sickness, unaware that their restlessness, their sense of meaninglessness, their desperate pursuit of finite satisfactions reveals their nature as spiritual beings who require proper relationship with the eternal. This spiritual diagnosis reveals both our dignity as beings capable of relationship with God and our predicament as beings who can fail to achieve this relationship, living instead in the sickness unto death that characterizes inauthentic existence. Most people live their entire lives in spiritual sickness without ever recognizing their condition. Kierkegaard delivers this shocking diagnosis of the human condition with surgical precision. The most common form of despair is not being conscious of being in despair. The vast majority of individuals exist in a state of unconscious despair, mistaking spiritual death for normal existence because they have never experienced authentic spiritual health. This unconscious despair manifests in ways that seem entirely ordinary: general dissatisfaction, restlessness, chronic boredom, or the persistent sense that life lacks ultimate meaning. Yet these symptoms are typically attributed to external circumstances rather than fundamental spiritual sickness. The individual blames their job, their relationships, their social position, or their material conditions for feelings that actually reflect a deeper crisis of selfhood. They seek remedies in change of circumstance, in achievement, in pleasure, in distraction, never recognizing that the problem lies in their relationship to existence itself. This unconscious condition is actually more dangerous than conscious despair because it prevents the recognition that healing is needed. The unconsciously despairing individual has no motivation to seek transformation because they do not understand themselves as spiritually ill. They may achieve considerable worldly success whilst remaining fundamentally alienated from their own authentic existence. They live, in Kierkegaard's devastating phrase, as though they were already dead. The awakening to conscious despair represents both crisis and opportunity, the recognition of one's fundamental spiritual sickness that makes healing possible. This awakening typically emerges during life crises that strip away the distractions and illusions. Maintaining unconscious despair, failure, loss, moral conflict, or existential questioning can shatter the comfortable assumptions that allowed spiritual sickness to remain hidden. Suddenly, the individual recognizes that their dissatisfaction is not merely circumstantial, but reflects a fundamental problem with their relationship to existence itself. This conscious recognition, whilst painful, represents genuine spiritual progress. It acknowledges the reality of the self's spiritual nature and its need for proper grounding. The individual who becomes conscious of their despair has at least recognized that they are a self, a being capable of relating to itself, and therefore capable of spiritual health or sickness. This awareness creates the possibility of transformation, even though it initially intensifies suffering by making the spiritual problem explicit and undeniable. Conscious despair takes two distinct forms, each representing a different strategy for dealing with the burden of selfhood. The first form involves not willing to be oneself, the attempt to escape from the responsibility and anxiety of authentic selfhood. The individual recognizes their spiritual nature, but finds it unbearable, seeking to lose themselves in external roles or activities that provide identity without requiring genuine self-determination. They flee from the terrifying freedom of authentic existence into the safety of conformity, routine, or absorption in finite concerns. The second form involves willing to be oneself in defiance of God, the attempt to ground oneself through pure self-assertion and defiance. Here, the individual acknowledges their spiritual nature but refuses dependence on any power beyond themselves. They attempt to create meaning and value through sheer will, establishing themselves as the ultimate source of their own existence and significance. This represents sophisticated rebellion against the fundamental structure of selfhood, which requires relationship with its eternal ground. Both forms represent elaborate strategies for avoiding authentic relationship with God, whilst maintaining the illusion of dealing seriously with existence. The first seeks escape from the absolute questions that selfhood poses. The second seeks to answer those questions through purely human resources. Neither achieves the transparent relationship with the eternal that would heal despair, but both acknowledge the absolute character of human existence that unconscious despair completely ignores. Remarkably, even defiant despair represents progress toward authentic selfhood by acknowledging the self's absolute nature and spiritual dignity. Faith stands as the therapeutic opposite of despair through Kierkegaard's precise definition. Faith is that the self in being itself and in willing to be itself is grounded transparently in God. This formulation reveals faith not as mere religious sentiment, but as the proper resolution of the self's fundamental relational structure. The self achieves authentic existence by relating to itself correctly, through relating properly to God as the power that established it. This creates genuine healing rather than mere symptom management. Faith addresses the fundamental spiritual sickness that manifests as despair by establishing the self in its proper ground. This makes faith simultaneously the most natural and most difficult human achievement. Natural, because it fulfills our essential structure as beings who exist in relationship. Difficult, because it requires acknowledging ultimate dependence. The self that achieves faith discovers itself capable of authentic, willing, and genuine selfhood, precisely because it no longer attempts the impossible task of grounding itself. Faith thus represents not the elimination of the self, but its proper establishment. Despair, properly understood, becomes the path to authentic selfhood through accurate spiritual diagnosis that reveals both problem and solution. Conscious despair serves as spiritual pedagogy. Kmai. It teaches us about our nature as spiritual beings who cannot ground themselves and our need for proper relationship with God. This makes despair valuable rather than simply negative. It strips away false solutions and illusory forms of selfhood that prevent authentic existence. The aesthetic's pursuit of pleasure, the ethical person's conformity to duty, even the religious individual's attempts at self-transformation, ICA, all reveal their inadequacy when subjected to the scrutiny of conscious despair. The intensity of despair often correlates with the depth of spiritual insight. Those who despair most profoundly frequently possess the clearest recognition of what authentic selfhood requires. Even whilst they resist the cure, the sophisticated forms of despair, despair over weakness, despair over strength, the despair that wills despairingly to be itself, each illuminate aspects of the human condition that less conscious individuals never recognize. Despair thus functions as unwitting preparation for faith. Authentic existence requires going through despair rather than around it. Attempts to avoid despair typically perpetuate spiritual sickness through strategies that prevent recognition of our spiritual nature. Aesthetic distraction offers endless variety, but no substantial selfhood. Ethical conformity provides social approval, but reduces the individual to a function of universal principles. Religious fanaticism creates the illusion of spiritual intensity whilst avoiding genuine encounter with God. Modern therapeutic techniques that promise happiness without spiritual transformation merely dress ancient evasions in contemporary language. Kierkegaard's insight penetrates these evasions. The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. Authentic healing requires facing the reality of our spiritual condition rather than fleeing into comforting illusions. The individual must confront the impossibility of self-grounding before discovering the possibility of being grounded in God. This makes despair a necessary stage in spiritual development, rather than simply an obstacle to overcome. The cure for despair reveals a profound paradox. Accepting our fundamental dependence on God becomes the foundation for authentic independence and self-determination. Faith does not eliminate the self or reduce human dignity, but establishes the self in proper relationship with its ground, making authentic selfhood possible for the first time. The individual who achieves faith discovers unprecedented freedom precisely through acknowledging ultimate dependence. This creates the distinctive character of Christian existence: maximum responsibility for one's choices and character, combined with ultimate trust in God's grace and power. The faithful individual takes complete responsibility for becoming a self, whilst recognizing that the power to become a self comes from God. Part 7. The Leap of Faith. Faith cannot emerge from objective evidence or rational demonstration, and any attempt to ground religious commitment in such proofs fundamentally misunderstands the nature of authentic religious existence. Kierkegaard's critique of rational theology and apologetics reveals how these endeavors, whilst appearing to support faith, actually destroy its essential character. He recognized that, if one wished to preserve myself in faith, one must constantly be intent upon holding fast the objective uncertainty, so as to remain out upon the deep, over 70,000 fathoms of water, still preserving my faith. This striking image captures the precarious nature of genuine faith and requires maintaining oneself in uncertainty, not eliminating that uncertainty through proof. The problem with objective certainty lies not in its falsehood, but in its very success. If we could prove God's existence scientifically, demonstrate religious truth through philosophical argument, or establish Christian claims through historical evidence, faith would become superfluous. It would transform into mere knowledge, losing precisely what makes it faith: the passionate personal commitment undertaken without guarantees. Kierkegaard saw that objective certainty would eliminate the risk that gives faith its transformative power and authentic character. When religious truth becomes objectively certain, it no longer requires the personal stake, the existential commitment that constitutes authentic religious existence. Historical evidence and philosophical arguments prove insufficient for generating authentic religious transformation, regardless of their intellectual merit. Kierkegaard's analysis of the limits of rational inquiry reveals why even perfect historical knowledge about Jesus would not automatically create faith. One could possess complete historical documentation of Christ's life, understand every philosophical argument for God's existence, and grasp all theological doctrines whilst remaining fundamentally unchanged in one's relationship to existence itself. This demonstrates that religious truth belongs to an entirely different category than objective knowledge and requires a different mode of appropriation. The historical Jesus, approached through scholarly investigation, yields only historical facts, dates, events, probable sayings, cultural context, But faith concerns the living relationship between the individual and the eternal, not historical information about past events. Even if historical research could establish every detail of Jesus' life with complete certainty, this would not resolve the fundamental question that faith addresses: how should one exist before God? The personal transformation that authentic Christianity requires cannot be generated through accumulating objective information, no matter how accurate or comprehensive. The demand for certainty before religious commitment reveals itself as a form of spiritual cowardice that avoids the very risk and responsibility that authentic existence requires. When individuals insist on rational proof before making religious commitments, they seek to eliminate the personal stake that gives those commitments their significance. Kierkegaard understood that without risk, there is no faith. The demand for certainty attempts to preserve the benefits of religious commitment whilst avoiding its costs. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how authentic human commitments function. The insistence on proof masks a deeper unwillingness to take responsibility for one's ultimate commitments and to live with the uncertainty that characterizes authentic human existence. It seeks the comfort of necessity where only freedom can operate, demanding that existence provide guarantees where individuals must take personal responsibility. This demand for certainty often reflects not intellectual rigor but existential timidity. NSF. The fear of making commitments that cannot be justified through external authority. The leap of faith becomes necessary precisely when understanding reaches its proper limits, and passion must assume responsibility for commitments that reason cannot justify. Rational inquiry serves valuable functions within its appropriate sphere, but it cannot answer the ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that require personal decision and commitment. These questions: how should one live? What ultimate commitments should guide my existence? The absurd stands as the collision between human reason and the claims of faith, is the claims of perceith, not a mere irrationality to be dismissed, but the precise condition that makes authentic religious commitment possible. Kierkegaard defines it with striking precision. The absurd is that the eternal truth has come into being in time, that God has come into being, has been born, has grown up, and so forth, precisely like any other individual human being. This is not simply the impossible or the irrational, but the specific challenge that religious truth presents to human understanding. The absurd offers claims that cannot be rationally demonstrated, yet cannot be rationally dismissed. It creates the unique space where faith becomes both necessary and possible, where human freedom must choose without the security of rational certainty. The absurd differs fundamentally from the impossible by challenging reason without violating logical principles or empirical evidence. The impossible contradicts what we know to be logically or empirically necessary and can therefore be dismissed by reason. But the absurd presents claims that reason cannot resolve either positively or negatively. It occupies the territory beyond reason's reach, whilst remaining within the bounds of logical possibility. The incarnation represents this paradigmatic absurd because it involves categories, divine and human, eternal and temporal, infinite and finite. That reason cannot synthesize, yet cannot prove to be contradictory. This creates the distinctive challenge of religious truth. It cannot be accepted on rational grounds, yet it cannot be rejected on rational grounds either. The mind finds itself confronted with claims that exceed its capacity without violating its principles. The incarnation emerges as the ultimate absurd through its central claim that the eternal has entered time, that God has become human without ceasing to be God. Kierkegaard captures this with characteristic force. that God has existed in human form, has been born, grown up, and so forth, is surely the paradox, sensu strictissimo, the absolute paradox. This doctrine challenges every category of human understanding by claiming that ultimate reality has taken finite form whilst remaining ultimate. The paradox cannot be resolved through rational mediation without destroying either the divine or human element. To make God comprehensibly human eliminates the divine. To preserve the divine in ways that reason can grasp eliminates the genuine humanity. Yet the paradox cannot be dismissed without rejecting the possibility that ultimate meaning might enter finite existence. The mind encounters its absolute limit, not in contradiction, but in mystery that exceeds rational categories, whilst demanding personal response. The absurd cannot be mediated or made reasonable without ceasing to be absurd and therefore ceasing to require the passionate commitment that constitutes authentic faith. Every attempt to make religious truth rationally acceptable through philosophical theology, natural religion, or rational apologetics eliminates precisely the element that makes faith a genuine expression of human freedom and commitment. The absurd must remain absurd to preserve faith's character as risk, decision, and passionate personal appropriation rather than mere intellectual assent. This creates the permanent tension of authentic religious existence, living in commitment to truth that transcends rational demonstration whilst maintaining intellectual honesty about reason's limits. The individual discovers that faith requires not the suspension of intelligence, but the recognition of intelligence's boundaries and the courage to choose beyond them. In this space beyond rational security, faith becomes the passionate expression of human freedom, confronting ultimate questions that reason cannot resolve, but existence cannot avoid. Faith represents the decisive leap beyond rational proof into authentic religious existence, not through intellectual assent to religious propositions, but through the passionate commitment of one's entire being to God, despite the absence of rational certainty. Kierkegaard understood that faith is the objective uncertainty, along with the repulsion of the absurd held fast by the passion of inwardness, which precisely is inwardness potentiated to the highest degree. This passionate character distinguishes authentic faith from mere belief, opinion, or intellectual conviction. Faith stakes everything on God's reality and goodness without rational guarantee, transforming uncertainty into the very ground of religious commitment. The believer does not possess faith like a piece of knowledge, but lives faith as an ongoing relationship that demands constant renewal. This passionate quality emerges precisely from faith's uncertainty. If God's existence could be proven rationally, faith would become unnecessary, replaced by knowledge. Instead, faith thrives in the space where reason reaches its limits, where the individual must choose commitment without conclusive evidence. The passion of faith does not create religious truth, but provides the only means through which religious truth can be accessed and appropriated. Religious truth cannot be received objectively like scientific information, but must be subjectively appropriated through personal decision, risk, and commitment that engages the whole person. Kierkegaard insisted that the passion of inwardness is the truth, not because subjective feeling creates truth, but because religious truth can only be accessed through passionate personal engagement rather than detached observation. This inwardness creates the distinctive character of religious existence. The believer relates to God not as an object of study, but as the absolute reality that determines the meaning and direction of existence itself. This subjective appropriation makes authentic faith simultaneously the most personal and most universal human possibility. Each individual must make the leap of faith alone, in the solitude of personal decision, yet this very personal act connects the believer to the universal human condition of existing before God. The inwardness required for faith cannot be taught or transmitted directly. It must be developed through the individual's own struggle with existence, doubt, and the demand for ultimate commitment. The leap transforms the individual's entire existence through religious conversion rather than merely changing beliefs or adding religious opinions to an existing worldview. Authentic faith involves a qualitative transformation of the self's relationship to God, others, and finite existence. Not just new information, but new being. Kierkegaard analyzed how faith creates the new creature who lives simultaneously in time and eternity, relating absolutely to the absolute, whilst engaging relatively with finite concerns. This transformation affects every aspect of existence: how one understands oneself, relates to others, faces suffering, and finds meaning and purpose in daily life. The believer discovers that faith reorganizes the entire structure of existence around the relationship with God. Finite concerns remain important, but no longer ultimate. The believer can engage passionately with temporal responsibilities, whilst maintaining eternal perspective. This creates a new form of freedom, liberation from the anxiety of having to create ultimate meaning through finite achievements, combined with deeper engagement with finite existence. As the sphere where faith expresses itself concretely, faith reveals its ongoing nature as continuous, passionate, choosing in the face of uncertainty, rather than a single decisive moment that provides permanent security. Faith must be renewed constantly through repeated acts of commitment, trust, and obedience that maintain the relationship with God despite changing circumstances and persistent uncertainty. This makes faith a way of life, rather than a momentary decision. The believer must choose faith repeatedly in the face of doubt, suffering, moral failure, and the constant temptation to seek finite security rather than ultimate trust. This ongoing character creates the distinctive temporality of religious existence, living in constant decision, whilst trusting in eternal security, maintaining passionate commitment, whilst accepting ultimate mystery. Part 8. The individual against the crowd. The public, in Kierkegaard's analysis, represents one of modernity's most insidious inventions, a democratic abstraction that eliminates genuine personal responsibility. Whilst appearing to embody collective wisdom, this phantom entity claims authority over truth and morality without any individual taking responsibility for its judgments. As Kierkegaard observed with remarkable prescience, a public is neither a nation, nor a generation, nor a community, nor a society, nor these particular men, for all these are only what they are, through the concrete individuals who are everything in the relation. The public exists as pure abstraction, allowing individuals to escape the burden of personal conviction by appealing to what everyone thinks, or what public opinion demands. This mechanism proves particularly destructive because it masquerades as democratic participation, whilst actually preventing authentic individual engagement. When someone declares that public opinion supports a particular position, they invoke an authority that no single person can be held accountable for creating. The public becomes a convenient refuge from the anxiety and responsibility that authentic existence demands. Rather than wrestling with moral questions through personal reflection and individual decision, people surrender their spiritual autonomy to this anonymous collective voice. Mass media and public discourse accelerate this spiritual dissolution by creating the illusion of shared truth whilst destroying authentic individual commitment. Newspapers, public debates, and mass communication promise democratic participation, but deliver what Kierkegaard called the chattering, endless talk about important issues that substitutes for serious personal engagement with them. Complex personal and moral questions become reduced to simplified public positions that can be adopted without genuine understanding or commitment. This creates a particularly modern form of spiritual poverty, the illusion of being informed and engaged whilst actually avoiding the personal responsibility that genuine existence requires. People consume opinions rather than developing convictions. They participate in public discourse without ever making the individual leap into authentic commitment that transforms abstract knowledge into lived truth. The media creates spectators of existence rather than participants in it. Democratic society, despite its valuable political contributions, becomes spiritually destructive when its mechanisms are applied to questions of truth, morality, and authentic existence. The democratic emphasis on counting votes and measuring public opinion creates the dangerous assumption that truth can be determined by numerical majority rather than individual commitment to authentic existence. What works for political organization? Enmity, majority rule, equal participation, collective decision-making, becomes tyrannical when applied to the spiritual domain, where authentic existence requires individual decision and personal risk. This represents a subtle but powerful form of oppression, more dangerous than political tyranny, because it appears to be freedom. Political oppression at least allows individuals to maintain internal resistance and authentic conviction against external force. But the tyranny of public opinion operates through apparent consent, making individuals complicit in their own spiritual surrender. They choose conformity whilst believing themselves free. The crowd, therefore, is untruth, not because groups necessarily make wrong decisions, but because crowd mentality eliminates the personal risk, individual decision, and authentic commitment that constitute genuine human existence. As Kierkegaard declared with characteristic force, there is therefore no one who has more contempt for what it is to be a human being than those who make it their profession to lead the crowd. Leaders who appeal to mass sentiment rather than challenging individuals to authentic existence demonstrate profound contempt for human spiritual capacity. This creates the fundamental conflict that defines modern spiritual existence: the tension between social belonging and authentic individuality. Mass society promises participation whilst delivering conformity. It offers the comfort of shared opinion whilst destroying the conditions that make genuine conviction possible. Kierkegaard's philosophy begins with a radical declaration. The individual is the category through which, in a religious respect, this age, all history, the human race as a whole, must pass. This statement cuts to the heart of his entire philosophical project. Authentic existence cannot be achieved through collective wisdom, social consensus, or institutional authority. Every genuine truth about how to live, what to value, and how to relate to the ultimate questions of existence must pass through individual persons who take complete personal responsibility for their commitments. This makes individual courage not an admirable quality for exceptional people, but an absolute necessity for anyone who seeks authentic existence. The individual stands as the fundamental category because the most important questions of human life resist social resolution. How should one live? What do one owe to others? How should one relate to God? What kind of person should one become? These questions demand individual decision in a way that cannot be delegated to majority opinion or social approval. When we attempt to resolve them through social consensus, we systematically avoid the personal commitment and individual responsibility that authentic answers require. The crowd can tell us what most people believe, but it cannot tell us what we should believe. It can describe prevailing social attitudes, but it cannot determine what attitudes we should hold. This creates the inevitable structural conflict between authentic existence and social conformity. The individual who takes these fundamental questions seriously will often find themselves at odds with prevailing social expectations. This opposition is not accidental but necessary. Authentic existence requires the kind of personal commitment that social conformity systematically undermines. The crowd operates by reducing individual responsibility to social agreement, transforming personal conviction into collective opinion. But authentic existence demands that we take responsibility for our convictions precisely as individuals, even when, especially when, those convictions conflict with social pressure. Standing alone against mass opinion involves profound psychological and social costs. The individual faces not only external opposition, but internal doubt, anxiety, and the constant temptation to surrender individual conviction for the comfort of social belonging. This loneliness intensifies in democratic societies where social pressure presents itself as the voice of freedom and equality rather than obvious oppression. The majority appears not as a tyrant, but as the embodiment of reasonable, enlightened opinion. Resisting this pressure requires distinguishing between legitimate social obligations and illegitimate social pressure, maintaining genuine community whilst resisting crowd mentality. The crowd offers a perpetual temptation because it provides what individual existence cannot: psychological security, social identity, and relief from the burden of personal responsibility. Crowd membership tells us who we are through social roles, what we should believe through prevailing opinion, and how we should act through social expectations. It offers the profound comfort of never having to stand alone with our convictions, never having to take ultimate responsibility for our choices, never having to face the anxiety that comes with authentic individual existence. This creates the fundamental choice that defines human existence: the security of conformity versus the risk of authenticity. We can surrender our individual responsibility to social consensus and gain the comfort of belonging, or we can maintain our individual conviction and accept the loneliness and difficulty that authentic existence requires. This choice cannot be made once and for all. Social pressure and individual weakness create ongoing temptation to trade authentic existence for social comfort. The individual must repeatedly choose authenticity over conformity, personal responsibility over social approval, the difficulty of standing alone over the ease of following the crowd. But this analysis reveals why Kierkegaard places such emphasis on that single one, who embodies authentic individuality. This figure represents not isolated individualism, but genuine selfhood that takes absolute responsibility for its existence, whilst maintaining authentic relationship with others and with God. Kierkegaard dedicated his entire literary output to a figure he called that single one hin, enkelte times, in Danish. This dedication appears repeatedly across his works. To that single one. To him, the single one. One, dedicate this work. This is not mere rhetorical flourish. Kierkegaard conceived of that single one as both his ideal reader and the authentic human being who embodies genuine individuality through absolute personal responsibility. Only such a person, he believed, could understand the kind of existential truth his works communicate. Truth that must be personally appropriated rather than merely grasped intellectually. The single one represents authentic individuality achieved through genuine selfhood. This involves personal decision, moral commitment, and authentic relationship with the eternal. Being a single one stands in qualitative opposition to being part of the crowd, not because of physical isolation, but because of spiritual achievement. One can be physically alone, yet spiritually part of the crowd, lost in mass opinion and collective identity. Conversely, one can be physically surrounded by others, yet spiritually a genuine individual who maintains authentic selfhood through personal responsibility. This distinction reveals something profound about human existence. The crowd eliminates personal responsibility by offering the comfort of shared opinion and collective identity. When we think as the crowd thinks, choose as the crowd chooses, we escape the burden of genuine decision. The crowd provides ready-made answers, established patterns, social roles that spare us the anxiety of authentic choice. But this comfort comes at the price of selfhood. The single one, by contrast, accepts absolute responsibility for existence. This responsibility cannot be shared with others, delegated to institutions, or justified by appeal to social consensus. Each individual must answer ultimately for their own choices, commitments, and spiritual development. Each must take full responsibility for becoming the kind of person they choose to be. This creates both the terror and the dignity of human existence. Terror, because we cannot escape ultimate responsibility. Dignity, because this responsibility reflects our nature as spiritual beings. Kierkegaard understood that this absolute responsibility forms the foundation for authentic relationship rather than an obstacle to genuine community. The paradox emerges clearly. Authentic individuals are capable of genuine relationship, whilst crowd members can only form mass aggregations. The single one who has achieved authentic selfhood through relationship with God becomes capable of authentic love, genuine friendship, and real community that respects the individuality of others. This creates the possibility of authentic human community based on mutual recognition of each person's absolute worth and individual responsibility. Such community stands in sharp contrast to mass conformity or collective identity that dissolves individual responsibility into group consensus. The single one can love others authentically, precisely because they have achieved authentic selfhood. They have something genuine to offer, rather than merely reflecting back the crowd's expectations. Kierkegaard's vision of authentic individuality thus provides the foundation for genuine social reform and authentic religious community. The single one who takes absolute responsibility for their existence before God becomes capable of genuine transformation, both personal and social. They can challenge established patterns precisely because they do not depend on social approval for their sense of identity and worth. This understanding of authentic individuality reveals why Kierkegaard wrote as he did, why he employed pseudonyms, indirect communication, and deliberately complex literary strategies. Only that single one who has begun the journey toward authentic selfhood can understand existential truth. Such truth cannot be transmitted like objective information or scientific data. It must be personally appropriated through the reader's own existential engagement. The single one serves as Kierkegaard's ideal reader, because only someone committed to authentic individuality can grasp the kind of transformation his works invite. This reader approaches the text not seeking comfortable answers or social confirmation, but ready for the demanding work of personal appropriation that genuine spiritual development requires. Part 9. The critique of Christendom. The triumph of Christianity in 19th century Europe appeared complete. In Denmark, as across the continent, Christian institutions dominated social life. Christian morality shaped legal codes, and Christian culture provided the framework for intellectual and artistic expression. The Danish state church stood as the established religion, its teachings woven into the fabric of national identity. To be Danish was to be Christian, and to be Christian required nothing more than accepting the religious and moral inheritance of one's society. This seemed the fulfillment of Christianity's historical mission, ICA, the transformation of the world according to Christian principles. Yet Kierkegaard recognized in this apparent success the most profound betrayal of Christian truth. The Christianity of the New Testament simply does not exist, he declared. Here there is nothing to reform. What has to be done is to throw light upon a criminal case. The crime was not the corruption of Christianity, but its transformation into something fundamentally opposite to itself. Where the New Testament demanded radical discipleship, Christendom offered social respectability. Where Jesus called for personal transformation through suffering and sacrifice, the established church provided comfortable moral guidelines and reassuring rituals. Where authentic Christianity required individuals to risk everything in personal relationship with God, institutional Christianity made faith a matter of social membership and cultural inheritance. This transformation was not accidental corruption, but the inevitable result of attempting to make Christianity into a social religion. The moment Christianity becomes socially acceptable, it ceases to be Christianity. The New Testament presents a religion that necessarily creates conflict with worldly values. Jesus explicitly warned that his followers would be hated by the world, that they must take up their cross, that they cannot serve both God and mammon. These teachings reveal Christianity as essentially a religion of individual transformation that will always create tension with social orders organized around worldly success, comfort, and respectability. The Danish state church exemplified how Christian success becomes Christian failure through the bureaucratization and domestication of radical religious truth. Professional clergy, with economic and social incentives to make Christianity acceptable to the established order, transformed the demanding religion of discipleship into a comfortable career. These parsons, as Kierkegaard called them, had made Christianity socially palatable by eliminating precisely those elements that require personal transformation. The willingness to suffer, to sacrifice, to stand alone against social pressure when conscience demands it. The institutional structure systematically removed the personal risk and individual commitment that constitute authentic Christian existence. The fundamental incompatibility between authentic Christianity and worldly accommodation becomes clear when we recognize that genuine Christian discipleship necessarily involves conflict with social expectations. Christianity cannot be both socially successful and authentically Christian because its essential character as a religion of individual transformation through costly discipleship contradicts the project of creating a Christian society. The attempt to make Christianity socially triumphant necessarily destroys what makes it Christian. The personal relationship with God that transforms the individual, regardless of social consequences. This analysis reveals that the question is not how to reform Christendom, but how to recover authentic Christian discipleship. The path leads not through institutional change, but through individual commitment to the imitation of Christ, rather than mere admiration. A transformation that requires personal suffering and sacrifice, rather than social respectability. Kierkegaard draws a devastating distinction between admiring Christ and following him. A distinction that exposes the fundamental corruption of Christendom. The admirer, he observes, never makes any true sacrifices. He always plays it safe. Though in words, phrases, songs, he is inexhaustible about how highly he prizes Christ. He renounces nothing, gives up nothing, will not reconstruct his life, will not be what he admires, and will not let his life express what it is he supposedly admires. This admiration has become the essence of Christendom, a religion of appreciation rather than transformation, of celebration rather than imitation. Christendom has transformed Christianity into something safe, respectable, and socially advantageous. It honors Christ's moral teachings whilst avoiding their personal application. It celebrates his sacrifice whilst refusing to make any sacrifices of its own. It praises his love whilst maintaining comfortable distance from the costly demands of discipleship. The admirer can speak eloquently about Christ's significance, write scholarly treatises about his teachings, and compose beautiful hymns about his glory, all whilst living a life that bears no resemblance to the radical existence Christ demanded of his followers. This distinction reveals why Christendom has made Christianity into its opposite. Where Christ called his followers to narrow gates and difficult paths, Christendom offers broad acceptance and social respectability. Where Christ promised his disciples would face persecution and suffering, Christendom provides comfortable membership in established society. The admirer has successfully transformed the most radical figure in history into a patron saint of conventional morality and social conformity. The authentic Christian path demands something entirely different. Jesus explicitly warned his followers that discipleship involves taking up one's cross, losing one's life to find it, and being willing to abandon family and possessions for the sake of the kingdom. These are not metaphorical flourishes, but literal descriptions of what following Christ requires. The gospel presents Christianity as necessarily involving personal cost, social conflict, and the willingness to sacrifice worldly success for spiritual authenticity. This radical character makes Christianity fundamentally incompatible with the comfortable, socially respectable religion that Christendom has created. Christ's teachings about loving one's enemies, giving away one's possessions, and refusing to resist evil create inevitable conflict with worldly values and social expectations. The authentic Christian cannot simultaneously serve God and mammon, cannot love both Christ and the world's approval. This incompatibility explains why early Christians faced persecution, not because they held unusual theological opinions, but because their transformed lives challenged the fundamental assumptions of their society. Kierkegaard recognizes that Christianity communicates truth through existence rather than through doctrine. Christianity is not a doctrine but an existence communication, he insists. It reveals truth through the transformed life of the believer rather than through theological propositions or moral teachings. This makes authentic Christianity necessarily individual and personal, rather than institutional and social. The Christian truth cannot be learned from books or sermons, but must be lived in the concrete circumstances of one's existence. This existence communication transforms every aspect of life and ever. How one relates to money, power, social status, family relationships, and personal ambition. The gospel demands not merely intellectual assent to Christian doctrines, but the reconstruction of one's entire existence according to Christ's pattern. This reconstruction cannot be accomplished through church membership or religious observance, but requires the individual's direct relationship with God and willingness to follow Christ regardless of social consequences. The difference between being a Christian in Christendom and being a Christian in truth becomes clear through this lens. Being a Christian in Christendom involves accepting the socially established form of Christianity. attending services, affirming orthodox doctrines, following conventional Christian morality, even whilst maintaining one's comfortable position in society. Kierkegaard's final campaign against the Danish church represents the ultimate expression of his lifelong commitment to authentic Christianity over institutional respectability. In 1854, through his series of pamphlets titled The Moment and articles in various publications, he launched a direct and uncompromising attack on the established church, its clergy, and its comfortable accommodation with worldly values. This was not the desperate act of a man losing his faith, but rather the courageous defense of Christianity against its institutional betrayal. Kierkegaard understood that defending authentic Christianity required attacking the Christian church itself, a position that demanded extraordinary personal courage because it meant standing alone against the entire religious establishment of Danish society. The established church, Kierkegaard argued, had created a false alternative between church membership and authentic discipleship. He recognized that the established order has taken the liberty of watering down Christianity to such a degree that it is no longer Christianity. The church had made Christianity so comfortable, so socially acceptable, so aligned with bourgeois respectability that it no longer required the personal transformation and costly discipleship that constitute authentic Christian existence. Church membership had become a social convention rather than a spiritual commitment. The clergy preached sermons that comforted rather than challenged, that confirmed social prejudices rather than demanded radical transformation. Christianity had been domesticated, turned into a religion of comfort rather than a call to costly discipleship. This institutional corruption created an impossible situation for anyone seeking authentic Christian existence. The church claimed to represent Christianity whilst simultaneously making genuine Christianity nearly impossible. Kierkegaard saw that the established church was not merely failing to promote authentic Christianity, it was actively preventing it by offering a false substitute that satisfied people's religious needs without requiring genuine spiritual transformation. The tragedy was that people believed they were Christians because they attended church, participated in religious ceremonies, and accepted the social identity of Christianity whilst remaining fundamentally unchanged by the radical demands of authentic Christian existence. Kierkegaard came to believe that institutional corruption of this magnitude could not be reformed, but must be exposed and rejected completely. The established church was so thoroughly corrupted by worldly accommodation that reform was impossible. Only complete rejection of false Christianity could create space for authentic Christian existence to emerge. This recognition required him to take the seemingly paradoxical position of attacking Christianity in order to defend it. He was willing to be seen as an enemy of Christianity by both secular critics and religious authorities in order to expose the fundamental difference between authentic Christianity and its institutional betrayal. This final campaign embodied Kierkegaard's fundamental philosophical principle that authentic existence requires the courage to stand as a single one against crowd pressure, even when the crowd includes religious authorities claiming divine sanction. His attack on the church was the ultimate expression of his commitment to individual authenticity over social conformity. He understood that the religious establishment represented the most subtle and dangerous form of crowd pressure because it claimed not merely social authority, but divine authority. Standing against the church required not only intellectual courage, but spiritual courage. HN. The willingness to risk one's eternal salvation for the sake of authentic existence. The personal cost of this campaign was enormous. Kierkegaard sacrificed his social reputation, his financial security, and his personal relationships. The stress of standing alone against the entire religious establishment of his society destroyed his health. He died in November 1855, shortly after launching his attack on the church, having literally given his life for his commitment to authentic existence over social acceptance. Part 10. Irony and Indirect Communication. The most profound truths about human existence resist direct communication. Kierkegaard recognized that whilst objective knowledge, NCN, mathematical theorems, historical facts, scientific principles, can be transmitted straightforwardly from teacher to student, existential truth operates according to entirely different principles. The deepest questions about how to live, what to value, and how to relate to the eternal cannot be learned like information because they demand personal transformation rather than intellectual comprehension. This distinction cuts to the heart of human existence itself. When someone attempts to communicate existential truth directly, telling another person how they should live or what they should believe, they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of such truth. Existential reality must be appropriated individually through personal experience, individual decision, and lived commitment. The moment such truth becomes external instruction, it ceases to be existential truth and becomes mere information about existence. Consider the paradox this creates. The teacher who claims to possess wisdom about authentic living and attempts to share it directly actually prevents authentic understanding. By providing answers that should be personally discovered, direct communication creates dependence rather than independence, external authority rather than individual responsibility. The student receives ready-made solutions to problems they have never genuinely confronted, answers to questions they have never authentically asked. Kierkegaard understood that no one can be helped directly. Authentic assistance requires creating conditions where individuals can discover truth for themselves rather than receiving it from external sources. This makes traditional forms of philosophical and religious authority spiritually dangerous. They substitute external dependence for the individual responsibility that authentic existence demands. The moment someone accepts existential truth on external authority, they have already failed to achieve the personal appropriation that such truth requires. This insight illuminates why Socratic irony serves as the model for authentic philosophical communication. Socrates claimed to know nothing, whilst helping others discover their own ignorance through questioning that revealed the inadequacy of their assumed knowledge. This ironic method respects human freedom by refusing to impose answers, whilst creating conditions where authentic learning can occur through personal discovery. The Socratic approach proves particularly appropriate for existential questions, precisely because such questions cannot be answered through external instruction, but only through personal commitment and individual decision. When Socrates exposed the ignorance of those who claimed wisdom, he forced them to confront their actual condition rather than their assumed knowledge. This confrontation with ignorance becomes the beginning of authentic philosophical inquiry. Yet even this analysis reveals a deeper problem. Human beings naturally resist the kind of rigorous self-examination that authentic existence requires. Direct moral or religious instruction typically produces either superficial compliance or defensive rejection. People accept external answers to avoid the difficulty of personal discovery, or they reject such answers to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. This resistance necessitates what Kierkegaard recognized as a form of loving deception. NCO, the need to trick people into authentic self-examination rather than giving them direct answers. Such trickery respects human freedom whilst promoting genuine self-discovery. It refuses to violate individual autonomy whilst creating conditions where authentic growth becomes possible. Indirect communication bypasses the natural defenses that direct instruction encounters. Rather than triggering immediate acceptance or rejection, it creates space for personal reflection and individual discovery. This approach recognizes that authentic transformation cannot be imposed from outside, but must emerge from within through personal recognition and individual commitment. This makes indirect communication not merely a pedagogical technique, but an ethical necessity for anyone genuinely concerned with promoting authentic human development. Kierkegaard refused to speak in his own voice about the most important questions of human existence. Instead, he created an entire gallery of fictional authors: Johannes Climacus, Johannes de Silentio, Vigilius Haufniensis, Anti-Climacus, and others, each with distinct perspectives, styles, and philosophical positions. This wasn't literary playfulness or academic evasion. It was philosophical necessity. The moment Kierkegaard claimed personal authority for any particular view of how one should live, he would destroy the very freedom that authentic existence requires. Each pseudonym represents a different existential possibility that readers must evaluate and choose among, rather than accepting as authoritative doctrine. Johannes the Aesthete embodies the aesthetic stage of existence, living for immediate pleasure and avoiding commitment. Judge William represents the ethical stage, choosing duty and universal moral principles. Johannes de Silentio represents the religious stage, embracing faith beyond rational justification. Other pseudonyms explore intermediate positions and transitions between these fundamental approaches to human existence. This creates what we might call an existential laboratory. Different approaches to the human condition are presented dramatically rather than dogmatically. The aesthetic pseudonym makes the strongest possible case for living in the moment, pursuing beauty and pleasure, avoiding the burden of permanent commitments. The ethical pseudonym argues equally compellingly for moral duty, social responsibility, and the dignity of choosing universal principles over personal inclination. The religious pseudonym reveals the limitations of both approaches, whilst pointing toward faith as the ultimate ground of authentic existence. But Kierkegaard provides no authoritative guidance about which perspective is correct. The reader cannot simply absorb information passively, but must engage in the kind of personal reflection and individual decision that authentic existence demands. This makes reading Kierkegaard an exercise in existential decision-making itself. One cannot understand his philosophy without participating in the very process of self-examination and personal choice that he considers essential to human authenticity. The pseudonymous method embodies Kierkegaard's fundamental philosophical principle that authentic existence cannot be taught directly, but must be achieved through individual commitment and personal responsibility. Truth about how to live cannot be communicated like mathematical theorems or historical facts. It requires personal appropriation, individual decision, subjective passion. The moment someone else tells you authoritatively how to live, they rob you of the freedom necessary for authentic self-discovery. This makes Kierkegaard's authorship itself an expression of his philosophy. The form of communication matches the content by promoting individual freedom and authentic self-discovery. He serves truth by refusing to claim authority over truth. He promotes authentic understanding by refusing to provide easy answers. The pseudonymous works respect human dignity by forcing each reader to take responsibility for their own existential choices, rather than accepting external guidance about life's most important questions. This creates a unique form of philosophical writing that helps others achieve authentic selfhood through methods that respect individual freedom whilst promoting genuine self-examination. The pseudonymous method becomes the foundation for understanding indirect communication as the art of helping others discover truth for themselves rather than imposing truth upon them. Kierkegaard recognized that the deepest truths about human existence cannot be transmitted like information from one mind to another. Authentic selfhood, religious faith, genuine love, these realities must be discovered personally, lived individually, chosen in freedom. This recognition led him to develop what he called indirect communication, a method that respects the fundamental freedom of each person to become themselves, rather than accepting external authorities or imposed answers. The thing is, Kierkegaard insisted, to help a person to a point of view from which he can see what the religious is, not to provide religious answers, but to create conditions where individuals can discover religious truth for themselves. This requires something far more sophisticated than conventional teaching or preaching. It demands understanding human psychology, recognizing individual differences, and appreciating the various ways people resist or embrace authentic self-examination. Indirect communication serves love by refusing to violate individual autonomy, whilst promoting genuine spiritual growth. Irony becomes central to this method because it creates the space necessary for authentic self-discovery. Rather than providing alternative authorities to replace conventional wisdom, ironic communication reveals the inadequacy of established viewpoints, social conformity, and inherited beliefs without claiming to possess superior truth that should be accepted on external authority. This creates what Kierkegaard understood as productive uncertainty, a state that motivates genuine questioning and personal reflection, rather than defensive adherence to existing beliefs or passive acceptance of new authorities. The ironic method serves truth precisely by clearing away false certainties that prevent authentic inquiry, whilst respecting individual freedom to discover truth through personal commitment. When Kierkegaard wrote under various pseudonyms, each representing different life views and philosophical positions, he was not playing intellectual games, but creating a space where readers could encounter different possibilities for existence without being told which to choose. The reader must decide, must choose, must take responsibility for their own understanding. This approach reflects what Kierkegaard called the maieutic method, borrowed from Socrates but transformed for existential purposes. Like intellectual midwifery, this method helps others give birth to their own authentic understanding rather than imposing external knowledge or authority. The metaphor is precise. Authentic understanding must come from within through personal insight and individual commitment, not from external sources through teaching or instruction. This makes the communicator a servant of the other person's freedom and growth rather than a master who imposes knowledge or direction. The helper creates conditions, asks questions, presents possibilities, but cannot and must not make the crucial decisions that determine how another person will live. This method proves particularly appropriate for existential questions that cannot be answered through external instruction, but only through personal discovery and individual decision. Why must the most important truths be discovered personally rather than taught directly? Is less than #0. 5# is greater than, because existential truth requires personal appropriation and individual commitment that cannot be provided by external sources. Truths about how to live, what to value, how to love, how to relate to God, AI, these must be lived rather than simply understood intellectually. They require personal transformation that can only occur through individual decision and commitment. This recognition transforms authentic communication into an art requiring understanding each individual's particular situation, psychological makeup, and spiritual needs, rather than providing universal answers applicable to everyone. The communicator must become sensitive to where each person stands in their development, what resistances they face, what possibilities they are ready to consider. This demands not expertise in abstract truths, but wisdom about human hearts and the courage to remain humble about one's own understanding. Kierkegaard thus creates the ultimate paradox of authentic communication. The best way to help others discover truth is to refuse to claim possession of truth whilst creating conditions where personal discovery becomes possible. Part 11. Love and the ethical. The human heart naturally gravitates toward preferential love as the pinnacle of emotional and spiritual achievement. Romantic passion, deep friendship, and devoted family bonds appear to represent the highest forms of human connection. Relationships that transcend ordinary social interaction through profound personal knowledge, emotional intimacy, and mutual commitment. These special relationships create meaning and identity. Precisely through their preferential character, we love particular individuals for their unique qualities and our irreplaceable bond with them, not humanity in general or abstract principles of benevolence. The beloved matters more than others. This exclusivity seems to be what makes love valuable. The willingness to sacrifice for those we love most deeply appears to transcend ordinary self-interest, suggesting that preferential love elevates us beyond mere selfishness toward genuine spiritual development. Yet Kierkegaard's analysis in Works of Love exposes a disturbing truth beneath this apparent nobility. Preferential love, despite its beauty and devotion, remains fundamentally selfish. Erotic love and friendship are preferential love, he observes, and preferential love is actually another form of self-love. We love others for what they provide us: emotional satisfaction, meaning, identity, or simple happiness through the special relationship itself. Even the most sacrificial preferential love serves the lover's deeper need for fulfillment through the beloved. The devoted spouse, the loyal friend, the caring parent, all find their own spiritual and emotional needs met through their devotion. This makes preferential love, however genuine its care and real its sacrifice, ultimately a sophisticated form of selfishness that cannot provide the foundation for authentic moral existence. The Christian command to love the neighbor reveals love's true nature as unconditional commitment, transcending personal preference and emotional attachment. The gospel command to love your neighbor as yourself, and Jesus' radical teaching that we must love even our enemies, discloses what authentic love actually requires. Neighbor love differs qualitatively from preferential love because it is not based on special qualities, mutual attraction, or emotional reward, but on recognition of the other person's absolute worth as created in God's image. This universal love reveals that authentic love is fundamentally a matter of will and decision, rather than feeling and preference. It involves commitment to the other person's good, regardless of personal cost or emotional satisfaction. This transformation from preferential to universal love requires dying to natural selfishness through recognition that genuine love demands sacrifice of self-centered desire for authentic care of others. The movement involves a kind of death, frank death of the natural self, that loves only what serves its interests, and birth of the spiritual self, capable of loving others for their own sake. This transformation cannot be achieved through moral effort alone, but requires divine grace enabling human beings to transcend their natural selfishness. Here emerges the paradox of Christian love. It fulfills natural love by transcending it, preserves preferential relationships by grounding them in universal commitment. The devoted spouse loves their partner not merely for personal satisfaction but as neighbor. The caring parent loves their child not only from natural affection but from recognition of the child's absolute worth before God. This analysis of love's transformation from preferential to universal leads inevitably to examining how authentic love manifests in concrete actions and ethical responsibility, rather than remaining merely internal feeling or spiritual intention. Love presents itself to us as feeling, as emotion, as the stirring of the heart when we encounter beauty or goodness in another person. We speak of falling in love, of being swept away by passion, of the overwhelming power of romantic attachment. Yet Kierkegaard reveals this understanding as fundamentally mistaken. Love, in its authentic form, is not a matter of feeling at all. It is a matter of conscience, and hence not a matter of impulse and inclination, nor a matter of emotion, nor a matter of intellectual calculation. Love involves the will's commitment to act for the other person's good, regardless of feeling or personal inclination. This transforms everything we think we know about love. When love depends upon feeling, it remains subject to the fluctuations of emotion, the changes of circumstance, the inevitable cooling of passion. Such love cannot be commanded, cannot be evaluated morally, cannot persist through difficulty. But when love becomes a decision of the will, a commitment of conscience, it enters the realm of ethical reality. We can choose to love, we can develop love through practice. We can maintain love even when feeling fails us. This makes love fundamentally different from romantic emotion, aesthetic appreciation, or sympathetic feeling because it involves moral commitment that persists through changing circumstances and emotional states. The test of authentic love lies not in the intensity of feeling, but in the concreteness of action. Genuine love manifests itself through works, specific acts of service, sacrifice, forgiveness, and commitment that serve the neighbor's genuine good rather than the lover's emotional satisfaction. These works often require wisdom to distinguish between what the other person wants and what they actually need, courage to act for their good, even when they resist or misunderstand, and persistence to maintain commitment through difficulty and opposition. Consider how this challenges our typical understanding. The mother, who refuses her child's demand for sweets, serves love more truly than the indulgent parent who cannot bear to see tears. The friend who speaks difficult truth serves love more faithfully than the one who offers only comfortable agreement. The spouse who remains committed through illness and difficulty demonstrates love more authentically than the one who loves only whilst passion burns bright. These works of love may not be emotionally rewarding, may not generate the warm feelings we associate with love, yet they serve the other person's authentic needs and spiritual development. This reveals love as a practical skill that must be learned and developed, rather than simply a natural capacity that operates automatically. We must learn to see beyond surface desires, to genuine needs, to act for another's good even when it conflicts with our own preferences, to persist in service even when it goes unrecognized or unappreciated. Such love requires the development of character, the cultivation of wisdom, the strengthening of will. The hiddenness of genuine love emerges as perhaps its most distinctive characteristic. Authentic love seeks no recognition or reward, but serves the other person's good for its own sake. As Kierkegaard puts it, love hides the multitude of sins. It does not expose or condemn the other person's faults, but works quietly to promote their growth and well-being, without seeking credit or recognition. This hiddenness distinguishes genuine love from various forms of disguised self-interest that use apparent service to others as a means of gaining social approval, moral superiority, or emotional satisfaction. Hidden love serves the other person's freedom and dignity by refusing to create dependence or obligation that would compromise their autonomy and self-respect. When love announces itself, when it demands gratitude or recognition, it transforms service into a form of control. The recipient becomes indebted, diminished, made conscious of their dependence. But love that works in hiddenness preserves the other person's dignity while serving their genuine needs. They remain free to grow, to choose, to develop their own capacity for love without the burden of obligation to their benefactor. This hiddenness also protects love from corruption. The moment love seeks recognition, it begins to serve the lover rather than the beloved. The works become performances, the service becomes self-advertisement, the sacrifice becomes a form of spiritual pride. The biblical command reveals something extraordinary about the structure of Christian existence. Whoever loves God must also love his brother, and whoever does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. These are not two separate commandments requiring different loves, but one love with two expressions that mutually authenticate and reinforce each other. Christian love is simultaneously vertical toward God and horizontal toward neighbor in a way that makes each dimension absolutely dependent on the other. This prevents both abstract spirituality that avoids concrete human responsibility and mere humanitarianism that lacks ultimate grounding and motivation. Faith transforms natural human love into spiritual love by providing what human nature alone cannot supply. The recognition that authentic love requires divine grace, enabling human beings to transcend their natural selfishness and love others for their own sake. Faith provides both the motivation for universal love, recognition that all persons are created and loved by God, and the power for universal love through divine grace that enables genuine self-transcendence. This transformation does not eliminate natural preferential love, but grounds it in universal commitment that prevents it from becoming idolatrous or self-serving. Faith creates the possibility of loving others, not merely for their attractive qualities or their relationship to us, but for their absolute worth as persons loved by God. The paradox emerges. How do finite beings love the infinite, unseen God? Is less than #0. 5# is greater than through love of the visible neighbor whom God loves. This distinctive structure of Christian existence makes spiritual love concrete and practical rather than mystical abstraction. We love God not through direct contemplative experience, but through concrete service to the neighbors whom God loves. This makes Christian spirituality necessarily practical and ethical rather than purely emotional or contemplative. The paradox also prevents love of neighbor from becoming mere humanitarianism by grounding it in ultimate divine reality that gives each person absolute worth and dignity, transcending their social utility or personal appeal. Love reveals itself as both the content and the form of authentic religious existence. Simultaneously, what the Christian believes, that God is love, and how the Christian lives in love toward others. This makes love not simply one Christian virtue amongst others, but the fundamental reality defining both God's nature and authentic human existence in relationship with God. Faith, hope, and love are not separate elements, but different aspects of the single reality of life. Love becomes the ultimate test of authentic Christian existence and the bridge between individual spirituality and social responsibility. This analysis of love as the fundamental structure of Christian existence reveals the necessity of examining what makes such unified commitment possible. purity of heart as willing one thing, the concentrated devotion that overcomes the double-mindedness, preventing genuine spiritual development. Kierkegaard's devotional work, Purity of Heart, is to will one thing, reveals the fundamental requirement for authentic existence, the integration of the human personality around a single ultimate commitment. Most people, he argues, live in spiritual confusion because they will multiple conflicting things simultaneously. They want worldly success and spiritual authenticity, social approval and individual integrity, comfort and growth. This divided willing prevents genuine commitment to anything and creates the spiritual paralysis that characterizes both aesthetic and ethical existence. The aesthetic individual wills pleasure, novelty, and immediate satisfaction, whilst also wanting lasting meaning and deep relationships, contradictory desires that ensure disappointment in both areas. Even the ethical person often wills moral duty, whilst also willing social recognition for their virtue, compromising the very authenticity they seek to achieve. This spiritual fragmentation reflects the deeper problem of double-mindedness that prevents authentic existence. The double-minded person cannot achieve genuine satisfaction in any area of life, because every choice is compromised by conflicting commitments and competing desires. They experience the characteristic modern anxiety, restlessness, and sense that life lacks ultimate meaning precisely because they have no unified center from which to evaluate their choices or direct their energies. This double-mindedness prevents not only spiritual development, but also worldly success, because achievement in any area requires the kind of focused commitment that divided willing makes impossible. The businessman who also wants to be thought spiritual, the artist who also craves commercial success, the lover who also seeks multiple romantic options, theos, all find their competing desires undermining their effectiveness in every sphere they attempt to inhabit. Kierkegaard recognizes that achieving unified commitment requires complete honesty and transparency before God. Self-deception is the primary obstacle to spiritual development because it allows people to maintain comfortable illusions about their actual motivations and commitments. The person who claims to will God's kingdom whilst actually willing social respectability, or who claims to will truth whilst actually willing intellectual superiority, cannot make progress toward authentic existence because they refuse to acknowledge their actual spiritual condition. This honesty before God creates the possibility of genuine repentance and real spiritual growth by eliminating the self-flattering narratives that prevent recognition of one's actual spiritual needs. Such transparency also becomes the foundation for authentic relationships with others. By eliminating the pretense and manipulation that characterize interactions based on false self-presentation, purity of heart emerges as the foundation for both authentic selfhood and genuine faith through its role in creating the unified personality capable of making authentic commitments and maintaining them through difficulty and opposition. The person who wills one thing knows who they are, what they value, and how they should live, because they have developed criteria for decision-making rooted in their ultimate commitment. This unified will creates the possibility of genuine faith by eliminating the double-mindedness that prevents authentic commitment to God, and one cannot simultaneously will God and will oneself as ultimate. It also makes authentic love possible by eliminating the self-serving motivations that corrupt human relationships and creating the unified commitment to others' good that constitutes genuine love rather than sophisticated selfishness. Part 12. Time, Eternity, and the Moment. Human consciousness occupies a unique position in existence, simultaneously embedded in temporal sequence and capable of grasping eternal meaning. Kierkegaard identifies this as the fundamental structure of human existence. We are a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. Unlike other finite beings who exist purely within the flow of temporal experience, and unlike God or abstract ideas that exist in pure eternity, human beings exist at the intersection of these two dimensions. We experience the succession of moments, the passage of days, the aging of our bodies, all the constraints of temporal existence. Yet we are also capable of grasping truths that transcend temporal circumstances, making commitments that endure beyond immediate conditions, and relating to ultimate meaning that gives significance to our temporal experience. This dual nature creates both the dignity and the burden of human existence. Through our eternal dimension, we can transcend temporal limitations, seeing our lives from perspectives that extend beyond immediate circumstances. We can commit ourselves to values that remain constant through changing conditions, love persons whose temporal existence is fragile, and pursue purposes that extend beyond our own temporal boundaries. Yet we must live this eternal dimension entirely within temporal constraints. Our eternal commitments must be sustained through temporal uncertainty. Our ultimate purpose is pursued through finite actions, our transcendent loves, expressed through temporal gestures that can never fully capture their eternal significance. The present moment emerges as qualitatively different from mere temporal flow through human consciousness's capacity to transform chronological time into meaningful time. For purely temporal beings, present is simply a mathematical point between past and future, a location in temporal sequence with no special significance. But human consciousness transforms the present moment into the arena where eternal significance enters temporal existence through decision, commitment, and authentic choice. The present moment becomes the location where we actualize our synthesis of temporal and eternal. Where eternal values are expressed through temporal actions, where ultimate commitments are lived out through finite choices, where transcendent meaning is embodied in concrete circumstances. This makes human temporality fundamentally different from physical temporality. We do not simply exist in time but create meaningful time through our capacity to relate temporal experience to eternal values and ultimate concerns. Our past becomes more than mere sequence of events. It becomes the foundation of our identity, the source of our commitments, the repository of meaning that shapes present choice. Our future becomes more than temporal extension. It becomes the horizon of possibility, the arena of hope, the destination of purpose that gives direction to present action. The present becomes more than temporal location. It becomes the decisive moment where eternal significance is actualized through temporal choice. Yet existing as the meeting point of time and eternity generates fundamental anxiety through the psychological tension created by our dual nature. This anxiety emerges because we must make eternal commitments within temporal uncertainty, take ultimate responsibility for decisions made with finite knowledge, and maintain authentic existence through changing temporal circumstances that constantly challenge our eternal commitments. We experience the distinctive human predicament of living simultaneously in time and eternity. We cannot escape temporal limitations, yet we cannot be satisfied with purely temporal existence. This anxiety is not a psychological disorder, but the inevitable accompaniment of human consciousness as the synthesis of temporal and eternal dimensions. It reflects the genuine difficulty of our existential situation. we are called to live eternally significant lives within temporal constraints that make such significance both necessary and problematic. We must choose ultimate values without complete knowledge, commit ourselves to transcendent purposes through finite actions, and maintain authentic existence through temporal changes that constantly test the authenticity of our commitments. The moment emerges as the atom of eternity, the fundamental unit where eternal significance enters temporal existence through decisive human choice and authentic commitment. Time presents itself to human consciousness in two fundamentally different modes that Kierkegaard recognized as essential to understanding authentic existence. Chronos represents quantitative time, the mechanical succession of moments that can be measured, counted, and calculated with precision. This is the time of clocks and calendars, the temporal framework within which we schedule appointments and measure duration. Yet within this measurable flow of temporal succession, something qualitatively different emerges that transforms the entire meaning of temporal existence. Kairos represents qualitative time, moments of decision, crisis, and transformation that cannot be measured quantitatively, yet possess ultimate significance for human existence. These decisive moments occur within chronological time, but transcend its mechanical character through their eternal significance and transformative power. The distinction reveals that authentic human existence involves both dimensions of temporality simultaneously. We necessarily live within chronological time, subject to its constraints and limitations, yet we achieve authentic existence through qualitative moments of decision and commitment that give meaning to temporal experience, a moment of genuine conversion, authentic love, or ultimate commitment transforms not merely our present circumstances, but our entire relationship to temporal existence itself. The mechanical succession of moments becomes the arena within which we live out the consequences and implications of decisive choices that possess eternal significance. Authentic existence is constituted by these decisive moments of choice and commitment that create continuity and meaning within the flow of temporal experience. These moments are not simply psychological events or emotional experiences, but ontological realities that determine who we become and how we exist. The moment of moral commitment establishes our fundamental orientation toward ethical responsibility. The moment of authentic love creates the foundation for genuine relationship that transcends temporal circumstances. The moment of faith establishes our ultimate relationship to existence itself. Through trust in what cannot be objectively demonstrated. These decisive moments create personal history and individual identity by providing the commitments and values that give coherence to temporal experience. Without such moments, temporal existence remains merely a succession of experiences without ultimate meaning or direction. We become authentic individuals not simply by existing through time, but by making decisive commitments that transcend temporal circumstances while being lived out within them. The businessman who decides to abandon his career to serve others, the individual who commits to authentic love despite uncertainty about the future, the person who makes the leap of faith despite objective uncertainty, each transforms their entire temporal existence through a qualitative decision that cannot be reduced to temporal calculation. This structure of decisive commitment creates the existential urgency that characterizes authentic human existence. We cannot postpone ultimate decisions indefinitely because the refusal to decide is itself a decision that shapes our existence and character. The attempt to avoid decisive moments by maintaining all options open actually represents a fundamental choice for indecision that prevents authentic existence and genuine commitment. The individual who refuses to commit to authentic love in order to preserve their freedom has already decided against the possibility of authentic relationship. The person who postpones the decision of faith in order to gather more objective evidence has already chosen the standpoint of objective reflection over existential commitment. The temporal structure of human existence makes such postponement ultimately impossible, because time itself forces decisions upon us through the irreversible character of temporal experience. We age, circumstances change, opportunities disappear, and relationships develop or dissolve regardless of our desire to maintain all possibilities open. Kierkegaard's exploration of repetition and recollection reveals two fundamentally different ways of relating to our past and future existence. For Kierkegaard, recollection represents the backward movement of consciousness, whilst repetition constitutes the forward movement of authentic existence. This distinction proves crucial to understanding how genuine selfhood emerges through time rather than despite it. Recollection, as Kierkegaard analyzes it, involves the aesthetic or intellectual recovery of past experience for present enjoyment or understanding. The person who lives primarily through recollection seeks to possess their past as a completed object of contemplation. They transform lived experience into memory, finding satisfaction in the mental reconstruction of what has been. This backward movement characterizes the aesthetic stage of existence, where the individual seeks to maximize present pleasure through the sophisticated appreciation of past experience. The recollective consciousness treats time as a repository of experiences to be savored rather than as the medium of ongoing commitment and growth. Repetition operates through an entirely different temporal logic. Kierkegaard writes that repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions, for what is recollected has been, is repeated backward, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forward. This cryptic formulation reveals that authentic repetition involves recovering past experience, not as memory, but as resource for present commitment and future possibility. The person who achieves genuine repetition takes up their past in a new way, transforming previous experience into the foundation for deeper commitment rather than mere nostalgia. Authentic existence requires this process of repetition that transforms past experience into resources for present commitment and future growth. This differs radically from both mechanical repetition, or simply doing the same thing again, and nostalgic recollection, longing for past experience as irretrievably lost. Genuine repetition creates new meaning and possibility through the recovery of past experience within present commitment. The individual who achieves repetition neither rejects their past nor remains imprisoned by it, but discovers how past experience, including failures and limitations, can become the foundation for authentic future existence. This process demands both acceptance of one's past and commitment to transcending it through new choices and deeper understanding. The person cannot achieve authentic repetition by denying their history or by remaining trapped within it. Instead, they must discover how their complete personal history, including their mistakes and sufferings, can be transformed into wisdom and commitment. This makes repetition a creative act that synthesizes temporal existence with eternal meaning. Religious repetition represents the highest form of this temporal synthesis. For Kierkegaard, religious existence involves recovering eternal meaning within temporal existence, through the recognition that authentic spiritual development requires neither escape from time nor simple acceptance of temporal limitation. The believer achieves repetition by living fully in temporal existence whilst maintaining eternal perspective that gives ultimate meaning to temporal experience. This creates the distinctive temporality of religious existence. The believer lives in time but not merely for time, engages temporal concerns but not as ultimate concerns, and finds eternal significance in temporal relationships and responsibilities. Religious repetition resolves the tension between time and eternity by demonstrating how eternal reality can be lived within temporal existence without being reduced to it. The religious individual discovers that eternity is not the negation of time, but its fulfillment through the repetition that transforms every temporal experience into an occasion for deeper relationship with eternal reality. This repetition enables the believer to embrace temporal existence completely, whilst maintaining the eternal perspective that prevents temporal concerns from becoming absolute. Kierkegaard's character, Constantine Constantius, illustrates the problem of repetition in modern existence. Constantine attempts to repeat a pleasant experience, but discovers that mechanical repetition proves both impossible and meaningless. His attempt to repeat past pleasure destroys the very spontaneity that made it pleasurable originally. Part 13. Conclusion. Kierkegaard's philosophy reveals itself as a unified map of human existence, charting the necessary journey from aesthetic pleasure-seeking through ethical commitment to religious authenticity. The three stages of existence form not merely sequential phases, but interconnected modes of being that illuminate the fundamental structure of human development. The aesthetic stage exposes the futility of avoiding commitment through constant novelty and pleasure, whilst the ethical stage demonstrates both the necessity and ultimate insufficiency of universal moral principles for grounding authentic existence. The religious stage emerges as the completion of human development, where authentic selfhood is achieved through absolute relationship with God as the ground of existence. This progression gains psychological depth through Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety and despair. Anxiety reveals itself as the dizziness of freedom, the psychological manifestation of our capacity to choose ourselves and our existence. Despair functions as spiritual diagnosis, exposing our condition as beings who cannot ultimately ground themselves in finite achievements, relationships, or moral systems. Faith emerges as the cure that establishes authentic selfhood through proper relationship with the eternal, creating the paradox of genuine individuality achieved through ultimate dependence on God. These elements interconnect to form Kierkegaard's revolutionary vision of authentic existence. The individual, standing alone before God, whilst taking absolute responsibility for their choices and commitments. This creates the fundamental paradox of authentic individuality, ANC, maximum personal responsibility, combined with ultimate trust in divine grace, complete commitment to one's own decisions, combined with recognition that one cannot ground oneself ultimately. The authentic individual must possess both the courage to stand as a single one against social pressure and the humility to acknowledge dependence on God as the source of genuine selfhood. This vision resolves the apparent tension between individual authenticity and genuine community. Authentic individuals become capable of real love and genuine relationship precisely because they are grounded in God rather than in their own needs, social approval, or the crowd's validation. They can give themselves fully to others because they have received themselves from the eternal ground of existence. Kierkegaard's influence extends far beyond his historical moment, establishing him as the father of existentialism and transforming modern understanding of authenticity, subjectivity, and the human condition. His revolutionary insight that existence precedes essence, ECO, that human beings must create themselves through their choices rather than discovering predetermined essences, provided the foundation for later existentialist thinkers like Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus. His analysis of anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith became central concepts in modern psychology, theology, and social criticism. His critique of systematic philosophy, an emphasis on subjective truth, transformed philosophy itself, challenging the assumption that human existence could be comprehended through objective, rational systems. His analysis of the individual against the crowd remains urgently relevant to contemporary discussions of authenticity in the age of social media, mass culture, and the search for meaning in modern life. Yet Kierkegaard's ultimate revelation transcends historical influence. Existence cannot be systematized or made comfortable, but must be lived with passion, commitment, and the courage to become authentically oneself, despite uncertainty and social pressure. The goal of human existence is not happiness, success, or even moral perfection, but authentic selfhood achieved through passionate commitment to ultimate reality in the face of uncertainty and opposition. This makes his philosophy both deeply challenging and ultimately hopeful. Challenging because it demands that each individual take absolute responsibility for their existence without rational guarantee, accepting the anxiety of freedom and the risk of faith. Hopeful because it reveals that authentic existence remains possible for anyone willing to make the leap of faith and live with passionate commitment to truth. His vision of authentic individuality provides both penetrating critique of modern mass society and positive vision of what human existence can become.